Think for a moment about the single most important surface in your life. It isn't the screen you're looking at right now, or the dashboard of your car. It's something far more humble, yet infinitely more revolutionary. It's a surface that carries our laws, our love letters, our greatest ideas, and our most trivial shopping lists. It's paper. We are so surrounded by it, so accustomed to its presence, that we rarely stop to consider the sheer miracle of its existence. But every single sheet, from the napkin at your coffee shop to the pages of a cherished book, owes its existence to a single, world-altering moment of genius in ancient China. This is the story of that invention, a discovery so profound it didn't just record history, it actively began to write it. Yet, the true story of paper's creation is shrouded in whispers and fragments, a historical detective story spanning 12 years. Who were the brilliant, anonymous minds that first transformed a tangled mass of tree bark and old rags into a smooth, white sheet? What secret, painstaking processes did they perfect in secluded workshops? Processes so valuable they were once guarded as closely as state secrets. This isn't just a tale of technological progress. It's a human saga of observation, experimentation, and a relentless drive to conquer the very limits of communication. We're about to journey back to a time when knowledge was heavy, carved in stone or etched onto precious bamboo, and witness the flash of insight that made it light, portable, and accessible. So, prepare to unravel a mystery that connects the imperial courts of the Han Dynasty to your own desk. We will sift through the archaeological clues and decipher the ancient texts to uncover how this seemingly simple material was born from a complex alchemy of nature and human ingenuity. We'll explore the fascinating puzzles that historians are still piecing together today, and discover how paper quietly became the unsung hero of civilization's greatest leaps, from the spread of religions to the spark of the Renaissance. This is the incredible, untold story of how a Chinese innovation became the very bedrock of global knowledge. And it's a journey that will forever change the way you see that ordinary, extraordinary sheet. But to truly grasp the magnitude of this invention, we first need to step into a world without it. Picture, if you will, a scholar in ancient China around 2,000 years ago. His greatest treasure isn't a thought or an idea, but the physical object he uses to record it. He reaches not for a notepad, but for a bundle of dried bamboo slips. Each slip is a narrow strip of bamboo, carefully prepared by boiling and drying to prevent rot. To write a single letter, he must painstakingly carve each character into the hard wood with a sharp knife. A short report might require dozens of these slats, and for a longer text, like a philosophical treatise or a historical record, he would need hundreds. These individual slips were then threaded together with cords to form a single heavy volume. A full book wasn't something you tucked under your arm. It was a cumbersome load, often weighing as much as a small child. The imperial libraries of the time weren't measured by the number of scrolls, but by the cartloads of bamboo required to fill them. Knowledge in this era had literal weight, and it was a weight that severely limited its portability and its reach. For those of higher status with greater means, there was an alternative: silk. Writing on silk was a vastly different experience. It was smooth, lightweight, and could be rolled into elegant scrolls. But the cost was astronomical. Silk was a luxury commodity, the result of an incredibly labor-intensive process of sericulture, weaving, and finishing. To use a length of fine silk for writing was akin to writing on a canvas of pure gold. This placed a severe economic constraint on who could afford to be literate and to share ideas. The very medium of communication became a symbol of wealth and privilege, effectively locking vast portions of the population out of the conversation. The flow of knowledge was choked, not by a lack of intelligence, but by the sheer, prohibitive cost of its container. We can see similar struggles across other ancient civilizations, each grappling with the same fundamental problem. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed styluses into wet clay tablets, creating durable but incredibly heavy archives. In ancient Rome, important documents were written on papyrus, which was lighter than bamboo but fragile, susceptible to moisture, and had to be imported from Egypt along vast trade routes. In India, they wrote on treated palm leaves. Every solution was a compromise, a trade-off between durability, cost, weight, and availability. These limitations weren't just minor inconveniences. They actively shaped the course of history. They determined which ideas were preserved and which were lost, which cultures could maintain complex bureaucracies, and how far a new philosophy or technological insight could travel. The world was filled with brilliant, isolated pockets of innovation, often unable to connect with one another because the physical bridge for their ideas, a cheap, durable, and portable writing surface, simply did not exist. This was the pressing, universal need that hung in the air, a problem waiting for a revolutionary solution. And that solution would not emerge from stone, clay, or silk, but from the most unexpected of places, a vat of pulpy, murky water and the discarded scraps of daily life. Into this world of heavy bamboo and priceless silk stepped a figure whose name would become forever linked with paper's origin, Cai Lun. The official story, the one recorded for posterity, points to the year 105 AD during the Eastern Han Dynasty, and credits this court official with one of history's most transformative breakthroughs. Cai Lun was not a scholar or an artisan by trade, but a high-ranking eunuch in the imperial court, a position that gave him both significant resources and a sharp understanding of the administrative needs of a vast empire. He served as the director of the imperial workshops, overseeing the production of instruments and supplies for the entire court, which placed him in a unique position to observe the inefficiencies of existing writing materials firsthand. The story goes that he presented his new invention, a sheet crafted from a mixture of mulberry bark, old rags, hemp waste, and even fishing nets, to Emperor He, who was reportedly so impressed that he granted Cai Lun an aristocratic title and widespread recognition. This moment was monumental enough to be formally inscribed in the official dynastic history, the Book of the Later Han, a text compiled centuries later, but drawing on contemporary records. This source describes the new material as being lighter and cheaper than silk, and more convenient than bamboo, a perfect solution to the empire's growing bureaucratic demands. For nearly 12 years, this has been the accepted narrative, a clean and satisfying origin story for an object that would change everything. It's a tale of a brilliant individual operating with imperial support, who engineered a solution to a pressing problem and was rightfully celebrated for his genius. This account provides a crucial anchor point, a date and a name that we can point to as the definitive beginning. Yet, as with many official histories, this version of events is almost certainly too neat, too simple to capture the full, messy, and collaborative reality of innovation. It raises as many questions as it answers, inviting us to look closer at the context and the clues that suggest paper's story began long before Cai Lun ever stepped into the imperial court. The official story of Cai Lun is compelling, but when we sift through the archaeological record, a much more complex and fascinating picture begins to emerge, one that suggests paper's birth was a slow cultural evolution rather than a single moment of individual genius. For decades, the narrative from the Book of the Later Hands stood largely unchallenged. Yet, starting in the 20th century, discoveries began to surface that directly contradicted this tidy timeline. Fragments of paper, some even bearing legible writing, were found in ancient tombs and outposts along the Silk Road, and when subjected to modern scientific dating methods like radiocarbon analysis, they were revealed to be significantly older than the year 105 AD. One of the most famous examples is a piece of map paper found in a tomb at Fangmatan in Gansu province, which dates to the early 2nd century before the Common Era. That's over 200 years before Cai Lun's reported presentation to the emperor. Another fragment, found at the Xuanquanzhai site, even contains characters and is dated to the reign of Emperor Wu of the Western Han, around the 1st century before the Common Era. These aren't just random bits of pulp. They are functional pieces of paper, evidence of a technology that was already in an experimental, developmental phase long before the court official's name entered the history books. This forces us to reconsider Cai Lun's role entirely. If paper already existed, what exactly was his monumental contribution? The most plausible interpretation, supported by many modern historians, is that Cai Lun was not the inventor, but the perfecter and, crucially, the official promoter. His genius likely lay in his position and his bureaucratic mind. As the director of the imperial workshops, he would have had access to various regional craft techniques and the resources to refine them. Think of it not as inventing the light bulb from scratch, but as taking a series of flickering, inefficient prototypes and developing a standardized, reliable, and mass-producible model. The specific mixture he presented, mulberry bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets, may have represented a significant optimization of the recipe, creating a sheet that was stronger, whiter, and more consistent than the coarse, experimental papers that came before. His true innovation was arguably in the systemization of production and, most importantly, in securing the imperial stamp of approval. By presenting this improved product directly to the emperor, he effectively launched it with the full marketing and administrative power of the Han state behind it. This act of official promotion was deeply intertwined with the political needs of the Han Dynasty. The Han emperors presided over a vast and complex bureaucracy that generated an enormous volume of records, from tax rolls and census data to imperial edicts and military orders. The cumbersome nature of bamboo and the prohibitive cost of silk were active impediments to efficient governance. A cheap, lightweight, and durable writing material was not just a convenience, it was a tool of state power. By officially endorsing and controlling the production of this new, superior paper, the court could streamline its own administration, consolidate knowledge, and enhance its control over the flow of information across the empire. Attributing the invention to a high-ranking court official like Cai Lun served a powerful symbolic purpose. It tied this revolutionary technology directly to the emperor's wisdom and the glory of the Han court, legitimizing it and ensuring its legacy would be recorded as an achievement of the central state, not the anonymous work of unknown artisans in a distant province. It was a masterstroke of public relations, transforming a grassroots technological evolution into a top-down imperial gift to the world. So, while Cai Lun's name is rightfully remembered, it's perhaps more accurate to think of him as the Steve Jobs of paper. Jobs did not invent the personal computer, the graphical user interface, or the touchscreen. His genius was in refining existing concepts, packaging them into an elegant and user-friendly product, and marketing them with a vision that captured the public's imagination. In a similar vein, Cai Lun took a promising but unrefined technology, systematized its production with imperial resources, and presented it as a finished, world-changing solution. This doesn't diminish his contribution. It simply reframes it. It shifts our focus from the myth of the lone inventor to the reality of collaborative, cumulative innovation. The story of paper's creation is a tapestry woven from countless threads, the experiments of early craftsmen, the practical needs of merchants and soldiers, and finally, the bureaucratic acumen of a court official who recognized its potential and gave it the platform it needed to conquer the world. This more nuanced understanding makes the journey of paper not less miraculous, but more human, a testament to how great ideas often simmer for generations before a single figure brings them to a triumphant boil. The discovery that would fundamentally rewrite paper's timeline came not from an imperial library, but from a humble tomb at a site called Fangmatan. Nestled in China's Gansu province, this archaeological site held a secret for over 2 millennia, a secret buried with its occupant sometime in the early 2nd century before the Common Era. When archaeologists carefully excavated the tomb, they weren't expecting to find anything that would challenge a cornerstone of historical narrative. Yet there, amongst the funerary objects, were fragments of something that should not have existed for another 200 years, paper. But this wasn't just any paper. These fragments bore the clear, deliberate lines of drawn maps. They weren't crude pulp or accidental byproducts. They were a functional, chosen medium for recording geographical information. The implications were staggering. Here was tangible, physical proof that the technology for creating a stable writing surface was not only known but was being practically applied for complex, illustrative purposes generations before Cai Lun was even born. This single find transformed our understanding from a story of a single brilliant inventor to one of a long, undocumented period of technological gestation. Let's paint a clearer picture of these extraordinary artifacts themselves. The paper fragments recovered from Fangmatan are, by necessity, described as fragments because time has been far from kind. They are delicate, discolored pieces, having survived in the dry desert climate of Gansu, which helped preserve them where a more humid environment would have caused them to decay entirely. Despite their fragile state, the purpose is unmistakable. Drawn upon their surface are black ink lines depicting mountains, rivers, and settlements, a cartographer's attempt to make sense of the world. The paper itself was analyzed and found to be made from hemp fibers, one of the earliest materials used in papermaking experiments. It's a coarse, thick sheet compared to the refined product Cai Lun would later present, lacking the smooth, consistent quality of later papers. It feels more like a craft in its adolescence, functional and revolutionary in its own right, but not yet perfected. This roughness is, in fact, part of the evidence. It shows a technology in a developmental phase, a prototype that proves the core concept of forming a sheet from pulped fibers was already being explored and utilized by anonymous artisans. They had solved the fundamental problem of creation, even if the pursuit of perfection was still ongoing. The true bombshell of Fangmatan lies not in the paper's quality, but in its date. Radiocarbon dating, a scientific method that measures the decay of radioactive carbon isotopes in organic materials, placed these map fragments firmly in the early 2nd century before the Common Era. To put that in perspective, this was around the time the Roman Republic was grappling with the reforms of the Gracchi brothers, a world away and completely unaware of the quiet revolution happening in China. This scientific dating is crucial because it provides an objective, verifiable timestamp that is independent of historical texts, which can be subject to bias, political agenda, or simple error. The carbon clock doesn't lie. The paper was made and used over 2 centuries before the year 105 AD. This turns the traditional narrative on its head. Cai Lun can no longer be the origin point. Instead, he becomes a milestone in a much longer journey. The Fangmatan maps force historians to ask entirely new questions. If paper was being made this early, how widespread was its use? Was it a regional specialty or a more common, if cruder, alternative to bamboo? How did the knowledge and technique travel and evolve over those 200 silent years before it finally reached the imperial court? This discovery elevates the story of paper from a simple tale of invention to a far more intriguing historical mystery. It suggests a hidden history of innovation, where techniques were likely developed and refined by unknown craftspeople, perhaps papermakers working in small villages, or artisans supplying the needs of local administrators and merchants. Their names are lost to time, their workshops long since returned to dust, but their legacy was literally buried in a tomb, waiting for a future generation to uncover it. The Fangmatan fragments are a powerful reminder that history is not always written in official chronicles. Sometimes, it's drawn on a piece of humble hemp paper and left in the dark, silently testifying to the slow, collective, and often anonymous march of human progress. This single archaeological find didn't just add an earlier chapter to the story. It revealed that the entire book was much longer than we had ever imagined. And just when we thought the story couldn't get any more ancient, the archaeological record delivered another stunning surprise, pushing the origins of paper even further back into the mists of Chinese history. While the Fangmatan maps revealed a technology in its adolescence, a discovery at a site called Baqiao, near the ancient capital of Xin, introduced us to paper's true infancy. Here, within a tomb dating to the Zhan Guo era, the tumultuous Warring States period that lasted until the year 221, before the Common Era, archaeologists uncovered fragments of a material that is unmistakably paper. To grasp the significance, consider the timeline. This paper was created and used roughly 100 to 200 years before the Fangmatan maps, and a staggering 3 centuries before Cai Lun's celebrated presentation to the emperor. This isn't just an earlier chapter. It's a prologue that fundamentally reshapes our entire understanding of paper's journey. The physical nature of the Baqiao paper itself tells a fascinating story. Unlike the later map-bearing sheets from Fangmatan, the Baqiao fragments are not a writing surface. They are thick, coarse, and uneven, with a texture more akin to a rough textile or a thick felt. Scientific analysis confirms they were made primarily from hemp fibers, a common material for rope and coarse cloth at the time. Their intended use appears to have been purely utilitarian, not for recording lofty ideas, but for the mundane tasks of wrapping and padding objects. Imagine a precious bronze mirror or a delicate ceramic vessel being carefully cushioned with this soft, pliable material before being sealed in a tomb. This humble purpose is a critical piece of the puzzle. It demonstrates that the initial impulse behind creating this new material was not necessarily for communication, but for protection and packaging. The invention of paper, it seems, began not in the scholar's studio, but in the artisan's workshop, born from a practical need to cradle and preserve other, more valued items. This distinction between a wrapping material and a writing surface is absolutely crucial. It reveals a long, slow evolution of the technology, a gradual refinement from a coarse, textile-like substance to a smooth, dedicated medium for the written word. The anonymous creators of the Baqiao paper had mastered the first, most fundamental step. They understood how to break down plant fibers through processes like retting, soaking them to loosen the fibers, and then mechanically pounding them into a pulpy slurry. They had discovered that this slurry, when poured onto a screen and left to dry, would mat together into a coherent sheet, but the final product lacked the fineness, the consistent thickness, and the surface smoothness required for a brush or a pen. It was a brilliant proof of concept, a material with immense potential, but its application was still limited to the physical world of objects, not the intellectual world of ideas. The existence of the Baqiao paper deals a decisive blow to the appealing but oversimplified single inventor narrative. How could Cai Lun be the sole inventor in the year 105 AD when a functional, if crude, version of his invention was already being produced and used 300 years earlier? The evidence paints a picture not of a sudden flash of genius, but of a slow-burning technological evolution that unfolded over centuries. Think of it as a relay race across generations. The first leg was run by the unknown artisans of the Warring States period, who discovered the basic principle of sheet forming from pulped fibers. The baton was then passed down through time, with each generation of craftsmen potentially making small, incremental improvements, experimenting with different fiber sources, refining the pounding techniques, or adjusting the drying process. The knowledge likely persisted in localized, specialized communities, perhaps families of craftsmen who passed their techniques down orally. By the time of the Fangmatan maps, the technology had advanced sufficiently to support drawing and writing, indicating the baton was now in the hands of innovators who saw the material's potential beyond mere wrapping. Cai Lun, then, appears as the final, spectacular sprinter in this long relay. He didn't start the race, but he refined the technique to a peak of quality and, with imperial backing, carried it across the finish line into global history. This perspective doesn't diminish his role. It contextualizes it within the far grander, collaborative tapestry of human ingenuity. The true story of paper is one of cumulative progress, where the contributions of countless unnamed individuals, stretching back to the wrappers of treasures in a warring states tomb, collectively built the foundation for a revolution that would eventually circle the entire globe. So, if we accept that paper's invention was a slow evolution, not a single event, then the next logical question is, what exactly were these early innovators putting into their vats? What was the magical recipe that transformed worthless scraps into a priceless medium for thought? The answer reveals a profound kind of genius, one rooted not in rare minerals or exotic imports, but in a deep understanding of the materials already at hand. The original papermaking recipe was a masterpiece of practical alchemy, turning the discarded and commonplace into something of enduring value. Let's break down this ancient formula, starting with its most humble component, old rags. In a world before mass-produced textiles, cloth was a valuable commodity. When a hemp shirt or a linen tunic became too threadbare to wear, it wasn't simply thrown away. Instead, these worn-out fabrics were collected, carefully sorted, and then cut or torn into small pieces. These rags were the foundational fiber source for much of early paper. The reason is simple yet brilliant. These textile fibers had already been processed. The act of spinning, weaving, wearing, and washing had naturally broken down the rigid plant structures, making the cellulose fibers within more flexible and easier to pulverize into the fine, separated strands needed for a smooth paper slurry. This was a closed-loop system of brilliant efficiency, centuries before the concept of recycling entered the modern lexicon. Alongside these rags, one of the most critical raw materials was hemp. For centuries, perhaps even millennia before paper, hemp was cultivated across China for a multitude of purposes. Its strong, fibrous stalks were processed into rope, coarser textiles for sacks and clothing, and fishing nets. This long history meant that papermakers had immediate access to a familiar, abundant, and renewable resource. They understood its properties intimately. The long, tough bast fibers from the hemp plant's inner bark provided incredible strength to the finished paper sheet. Think of these hemp fibers as the structural reinforcement, the underlying skeleton that gave early paper its durability, preventing it from simply disintegrating at the slightest touch. When a hemp rope frayed beyond use or an old fishing net tore, it wasn't trash, it was a potential ingredient. The inclusion of used fishing nets in the official recipe attributed to Cai Lun is a particularly telling detail. It speaks to a culture that saw potential in every object, a society that understood value could be extracted even from items at the very end of their functional life. This pragmatic approach ensured that the cost of production remained incredibly low, a fundamental reason why paper could eventually become universally accessible. But strength alone wasn't enough. For paper to become a pleasant surface for writing, it needed a finer, softer quality. This is where tree bark, specifically from the mulberry tree, entered the recipe. The papermakers of ancient China discovered that the inner bark, or bast, of the paper mulberry tree possessed a unique combination of long, flexible fibers that were also remarkably white. When processed, these fibers created a pulp that produced a much smoother, more pliable, and lighter colored sheet than one made from coarse hemp or rags alone. The mulberry fiber acted as the filler, the substance that gave the paper its body and its desirable writing surface. The process of harvesting this bark was a skilled craft in itself, typically done in the spring when the sap was rising and the bark could be most easily separated from the wood. This ingredient shifted paper from being merely a strong, utilitarian material to one that could appeal to the aesthetic sensibilities of scholars and court officials. It was the difference between a rough burlap sack and a fine linen sheet. Both are made of fiber, but one is clearly suited for a higher purpose. Now, imagine the process of combining these ingredients. The collected rags, hemp waste, and strips of mulberry bark weren't just tossed into a pot. They underwent a rigorous and multi-stage preparation. First, they were thoroughly washed to remove any dirt, grime, or impurities. Then, they were soaked in water, often in large vats or pits, for an extended period. This soaking, a process called retting, allowed natural bacteria to begin breaking down the non-fibrous components, loosening the bundles of cellulose. After retting, the real physical work began. The softened mass was transferred to a stone mortar and pounded with wooden mallets for hours on end. This relentless mechanical action was the heart of the transformation, physically separating and fraying the individual plant fibers until they dissolved into a thick, cloudy suspension in water, the primordial paper pulp. It was a demanding, labor-intensive process, but it was this very act of pounding that unlocked the hidden potential within the rags, bark, and hemp, preparing them for their rebirth as a single, unified sheet. The true economic and philosophical brilliance of this recipe becomes starkly clear when we contrast it with the material it ultimately replaced: silk. Silk was the epitome of luxury and exclusivity. Its production was an incredibly delicate, slow, and expensive endeavor, starting with the careful cultivation of silkworms, their meticulous feeding on mulberry leaves, the painstaking unraveling of the cocoons, and the intricate weaving of the delicate threads. To write on a length of silk was to write on a small fortune. It was a statement of wealth and status, a medium reserved for the imperial court, the aristocracy, and the most elite of scholars. Paper, born from rags and fishnets, stood in direct opposition to this. Its ingredients were not luxury items. They were the detritus of everyday life, the waste products of other industries. This fundamental difference in sourcing is what made paper revolutionary. It wasn't just a new product, it was a democratizing force. By building a writing surface from the ground up using cheap, abundant, and recycled materials, these ancient inventors created a technology that was inherently scalable and affordable. It shifted the economics of information from an elite privilege to a potential common right, setting the stage for a world where knowledge could, for the first time in history, become truly widespread. So, with this perfected recipe in hand, the Han Dynasty made a strategic decision of immense consequence. They classified the entire papermaking process. It became a state secret, a form of protected intellectual property guarded as fiercely as any military technology or map of imperial mines. This wasn't about mere commercial advantage. It was a calculated move to consolidate power on a grand scale. By controlling the very medium of information, the central government could exert unprecedented influence over its own vast bureaucracy, ensuring that administrative commands, tax records, and legal decrees flowed smoothly and securely from the capital to the farthest provinces. This internal efficiency was a massive source of strength, but the benefits extended far beyond their own borders. For centuries, this monopoly meant that China held a virtual global lock on the most efficient technology for storing and transmitting knowledge. Imagine possessing, in the ancient world, the equivalent of the printing press, the internet, and secure diplomatic communications all rolled into one, while your rivals and trading partners were still struggling with bulkier, more expensive, and far less versatile materials. This gave the Chinese Empire an incalculable cultural and geopolitical edge, a soft power advantage that lasted for generations. The penalties for attempting to steal this technology or reveal its secrets to outsiders were predictably severe, reflecting the immense value the state placed on its monopoly. While specific historical records detailing the punishment for papermaking espionage are scarce, we can infer the likely consequences from the general legal principles of the Han and subsequent dynasties. China had a highly developed legal system with harsh punishments for crimes considered threatening to state security or the emperor's authority. Revealing a state secret of this magnitude would almost certainly have been classified as a form of sedition or treason. The punishment for such crimes was often death, sometimes extended to the offender's entire family to eradicate any lingering loyalty or potential for revenge. Less direct but equally powerful was the control exerted over the artisans themselves. Master papermakers were likely treated like other highly skilled state craftsmen, such as weaponsmiths or silk weavers. They and their families probably lived in designated, state-controlled workshops or compounds, enjoying a comfortable life with steady provisions but under constant supervision. Their knowledge was their life, and attempting to take that knowledge beyond the empire's borders would have meant not just risking their own lives, but bringing catastrophic ruin upon their entire clan. This created a powerful system of control, where the reward for silence was security and status, and the price of betrayal was absolute annihilation. This secrecy allowed China to cultivate and project its cultural influence with remarkable effectiveness for hundreds of years. Knowledge, in the form of Confucian classics, Buddhist sutras, poetry, and historical records, was now recorded on a lightweight, durable, and relatively inexpensive medium. This facilitated an explosion of literary and scholarly culture within China itself, creating a large, stable, and well-educated bureaucratic class, the famous scholar officials, who governed the empire based on a shared canon of written wisdom. But the advantage was also external. As Chinese goods and diplomats traveled the Silk Road, they carried with them not just silk and porcelain, but also books and documents on paper. To the neighboring states and distant empires they encountered, this material itself was a marvel. The ability of Chinese envoys to carry extensive libraries and precise administrative records in a single cart, while others struggled with wagon loads of bamboo or fragile scrolls, was a silent but potent demonstration of their technological and organizational superiority. Paper became a symbol of Chinese civilization's sophistication, making its philosophy, its laws, and its art more portable, more transmittable, and ultimately, more influential than any other cultures for centuries. The monopoly was so effective that it took nearly 500 years for the secret of papermaking to finally escape the borders of China. The first known transmission occurred not through espionage, but through capture. In the year 751 AD, at the far western edge of the Chinese sphere of influence, the forces of the expanding Tang Dynasty clashed with the Abbasid Caliphate at the Battle of Talas, in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. The battle itself was a relatively minor conflict, but its long-term consequences were world-altering. Among the Chinese prisoners taken by the victorious Abbasid armies were a number of skilled craftsmen, including, as the story goes, several practiced papermakers. These artisans were transported to the heart of the Islamic world, to the vibrant city of Samarkand, which lay at a crucial crossroads of trade and culture. Recognizing the immense value of their skills, their captors did not imprison them, but rather set them up in business, compelling them to teach their craft. Samarkand, with its abundant supply of flax and hemp, quickly became the first major center of paper production outside of East Asia, its workshops producing a high-quality product that soon spread throughout the Islamic world, reaching Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. This event marks a pivotal turning point in global history. The genie was out of the bottle. The technology that China had so jealously guarded for half a millennium was now in the hands of another great civilization, one that would not only perfect it further, but would also become the crucial bridge that eventually carried paper to Europe. For centuries, the secret of papermaking remained one of history's most successfully guarded technologies, locked within China's borders by imperial decree and the formidable natural barriers of deserts and mountains. Yet, ideas have a stubborn tendency to travel, and the very trade routes that enriched China with foreign gold and exotic goods also created the perfect conduit for its greatest secret to slip out. The story of paper's escape is not one of a single dramatic heist, but a slow, clandestine diffusion, a whispering campaign of technology that moved from oasis town to oasis town along the sprawling network of the Silk Road. It was a journey driven by human curiosity, economic opportunism, and ultimately the fortunes of war. While the official channels were sealed, knowledge has a way of seeping through the cracks, carried by merchants who saw a new opportunity, by Buddhist monks who needed sutras to spread their faith, and by diplomats who understood the power of the material they carried. This slow bleed of information likely laid the groundwork, but it was a single, violent clash between two expanding empires that finally ripped the secret wide open and handed it to the world. That pivotal moment was the Battle of Talas, fought in the summer of 751 AD in a river valley in Central Asia, in what is now Kyrgyzstan. On one side was the Tang Dynasty, a Chinese empire at the peak of its cultural and military power, pushing its influence westward to control the lucrative Silk Road. On the other was the Abbasid Caliphate, a vibrant and expanding Islamic empire radiating outward from Baghdad, eager to consolidate its own control over the heart of Asia. The two giants collided not over a grand ideological principle, but over the control of a strategic frontier and the loyalty of a local client state. The Chinese army, led by General Gao Xianji, met the Abbasid forces, which were supplemented by their Turkic allies. The details of the battle itself are shrouded in the fog of time, but the outcome is clear. The Tang forces were decisively defeated. It was a military setback that, in the grand scope of Chinese history, was relatively minor. The Tang dynasty would continue for another century and a half. But the true, world-altering consequence of the battle was not measured in territory lost, but in the prisoners taken. Among the thousands of Chinese soldiers captured by the victorious Abbasid armies were a group of men whose skills were far more valuable than their swordsmanship. They were craftsmen, and according to persistent historical accounts, among them were skilled papermakers. Imagine the scene from the perspective of the Abbasid victors. They would have been familiar with paper as a finished product, a luxurious import that arrived in caravans from the East. They understood its utility and its superiority over their own primary writing materials, which included papyrus fragile and imported from Egypt and parchment, which was made from scraped and treated animal skins, a laborious and expensive process. To suddenly have in their custody men who possessed the actual, hands-on knowledge to produce this miraculous substance was an intelligence windfall of unimaginable proportions. This wasn't just capturing enemy soldiers. It was like capturing the entire research and development division of the most advanced technology company in the world. The Abbasids, being pragmatic and sophisticated rulers, did not throw these artisans into a dungeon. Instead, they recognized the immense economic and cultural prize they had stumbled upon. The prisoners were transported to the west, to the great cosmopolitan city of Samarkand, a bustling hub of trade and learning that was already a jewel of the Islamic world. There, they were compelled to establish a paper mill to put their knowledge to work for their new masters. Samarkand was an ideal location for this first beachhead of papermaking outside East Asia. It sat at the crossroads of civilizations, with access to abundant flowing water essential for the papermaking process, and ample supplies of raw materials, particularly flax and hemp, which were perfect substitutes for the mulberry bark and rags used in China. The paper produced in Samarkand quickly gained a reputation for its exceptional quality, becoming famous for its smoothness, strength, and whiteness. It was soon known as Samarkand paper, a coveted commodity in its own right. The city didn't just replicate the Chinese technique, it began to improve upon it. Arab papermakers are credited with innovating the use of starch-based sizing, which made the paper less absorbent and better suited for the flowing scripts of Arabic calligraphy, a crucial adaptation that helped the technology take root and flourish in its new cultural context. From this new epicenter in Samarkand, the knowledge of papermaking began its unstoppable spread across the Islamic world, moving like a wave from one great city to the next. It reached Baghdad, the dazzling capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, by the end of the 8th century. Under the patronage of the legendary Caliph Harun al-Rashid, paper mills were established, and the city became a major production center, fueling an explosion of intellectual activity during the Islamic Golden Age. The availability of cheap, plentiful paper was a catalyst for this cultural renaissance. It allowed for the systematic translation of ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, the creation of vast libraries like the House of Wisdom, and advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and chemistry that would later form the foundation of European science. The technology then traveled to Damascus, whose high-quality Damascus paper became another famous export, and from there to Egypt, where it finally supplanted the ancient use of papyrus, a material so old it had given paper its name. In each new location, the process was refined, with different fibers experimented with, and new techniques for polishing and finishing the sheets developed. This journey across the Islamic world took a few centuries, but it was a period of active, vibrant technological exchange and improvement, demonstrating how a borrowed invention could be embraced and perfected to serve a new civilization's unique needs. The final leg of paper's long journey into Europe was a much slower affair, slowed by both political barriers and cultural resistance. For centuries, paper entered Europe only as a costly import from the Arab world, a luxury item viewed with some suspicion by a Christian society that was often in conflict with the Islamic powers of the Mediterranean. The primary writing material in medieval Europe was parchment, made from sheep or calfskin. Producing a single Bible could require the skins of over 200 animals, making books incredibly expensive and rare objects. The first paper mills in Europe were not established through trade, but through conflict, appearing in those regions where Christian and Muslim worlds directly collided. The earliest known paper mill on European soil was in Zadova, in Muslim-controlled Spain, known as Al-Andalus, around the year 156. As Christian kingdoms gradually reconquered the Iberian Peninsula, they captured these paper mills and inherited the technology. Sicily, another cultural crossroads, also became an early point of entry, with paper production documented there by the 12th century. From these southern European footholds, the knowledge slowly percolated northward into Italy and then France, but it was a gradual process, met with skepticism from scribes accustomed to the enduring qualities of parchment. The catalyst that finally broke the dam and made paper indispensable in Europe was, ironically, another Chinese invention that would travel west along the same routes: printing. When Johannes Gutenberg introduced his movable type printing press in the mid-15th century, he created an insatiable demand for a cheap, uniform, and mass-producible writing surface. Parchment was far too expensive and inconsistent for the printing of hundreds or thousands of copies of a book. Paper was the only material that could meet this new industrial demand. The marriage of Chinese papermaking and Chinese-inspired printing created a perfect storm that shattered the old information order in Europe, fueling the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the rise of modern literacy. In this way, the capture of those few papermakers at the Battle of Talas set in motion a chain of events that would, 700 years later, fundamentally reshape the Western world. It was a slow-motion revolution, but its impact proves that the leakage of a single technology can, over time, change the destiny of continents. With the raw ingredients prepared, the next stage of this ancient alchemy required a specialized set of tools, a physical workshop where the chaotic slurry of fibers was disciplined into a perfect, uniform sheet. At the heart of this operation stood a series of crucial implements, each with a distinct and vital role. First were the fermentation vats, often large, sunken pits or substantial wooden tubs. This wasn't just a container for soaking. It was a biological reactor. The mixture of chopped bark, rags, and hemp would be submerged in water and left for weeks, even months. During this retting process, natural bacteria and microorganisms would feast on the non-fibrous components like pectins and lignins, the natural glues that held the plant cells together. The vat would bubble and stew, slowly breaking down the rigid structures and liberating the pure, flexible cellulose fibers. This was papermaking's slow, patient-first act, a controlled rot that was essential for creating a pulp that could be separated into its finest, most fundamental threads. The master papermaker had to be a judge of fermentation, knowing precisely by smell, touch, and sight when the brew had reached its peak, when the fibers were softened and ready for their transformation, but before they decayed into useless mush. Once the fermentation was complete, the softened mass was hauled out, and the real physical work began. The material was transferred to a stone mortar, where it was pounded relentlessly with heavy wooden mallets. This was brute force engineering at its most elemental. For hours, the worker would lift and drop the mallet, rhythmically beating the fibers, physically fraying and separating them until they dissolved into a thick, cloudy suspension in water. The goal was to create a homogeneous pulp where every individual plant filament was liberated and suspended, ready to bond with its neighbors. The consistency of this slurry was critical. Too thick and the sheet would be lumpy and uneven. Too thin and it would be weak and translucent. The papermaker judged this by feel, constantly testing the mixture to ensure it had the perfect, milky viscosity. This pulping stage was the bridge between the raw, wild ingredients and the refined, ordered sheet, a noisy, labor-intensive process that was the literal heartbeat of the workshop. Now came the moment of truth, the tool that defined the very essence of paper, the mold and decal. This was the papermaker's most ingenious invention, a device of elegant simplicity. The mold was essentially a flat, rectangular wooden frame, much like a small window. Stretched taut across this frame was a finely woven screen, made from thin strips of bamboo or, for the highest quality papers, silk threads. This screen acted as a filter. Sitting on top of the mold was a removable frame called the decal, which was identical in size but without any screen. The papermaker would take this two-part assembly and dip it, decal side up, into the vat of prepared pulp. With a skilled, fluid motion, he would scoop up a quantity of the slurry, then shake the mold from side to side and front to back. This vatman's shake was a gesture perfected over a lifetime. The motion caused the fibers in the water to slosh across the screen. The water would drain through the tiny gaps in the weave, but the interlocking cellulose fibers would be caught, settling into a random, tangled web on the surface of the screen. The decal's purpose was to create a clean, defined edge on this newly formed mat of fibers, preventing the slurry from slopping over the sides and ensuring every sheet was a uniform rectangle. In a matter of seconds, a formless liquid was given shape and structure. After the initial drainage, the wet, fragile sheet of paper, known as a waterleaf, remained clinging to the screen. It was at this point that another tool came into play, the couch, pronounced couch. This was a soft, absorbent felt, typically made of wool. The papermaker would carefully lift the decal off the mold, then invert the mold itself and press it face down onto a stack of these felts. With a precise pressure, he would transfer the new sheet of paper from the screen onto the felt. He would then place another felt on top and repeat the entire process, building a post or stack of alternating felts and freshly made paper sheets. This repetitive, rhythmic dance of dipping, shaking, couching, and stacking could continue for hours, creating a pile of hundreds of damp sheets. The couch felts served two vital purposes. First, they absorbed a massive amount of water from the paper, beginning the drying process. Second, and just as importantly, their textured surface imparted a slight grain to the paper, a subtle texture that can still be felt on high-quality handmade papers today. This stack of paper and felt was a precarious, waterlogged tower, a testament to the day's labor, but it was still far from finished. The final phase involved squeezing and drying. The entire post was placed into a massive screw press, a formidable tool often made of a large wooden beam with a threaded screw running through it. Workers would turn the screw, applying immense, even pressure across the entire stack. This forced out the majority of the remaining water, which would stream out from the sides of the press. This pressing compacted the fibers, bonding them more tightly and giving the paper its final strength and density. It also smoothed the surface, preparing it for writing. After pressing, the individual sheets were still damp. They were then carefully peeled away from the felts and hung up to dry, often in large, airy lofts or on heated walls. This slow, natural drying in the open air completed the process, allowing the hydrogen bonds between the cellulose fibers to set permanently. The result was a strong, flexible, and perfectly flat sheet of paper. Each tool in this chain, the fermenting vat, the pounding mortar, the ingenious mold and decal, the absorbent couch, and the mighty press, was a critical link. Together, they transformed a soup of discarded scraps into a medium that could carry the weight of human thought, a testament to a craftsmanship that understood the profound connection between physical process and intellectual possibility. With the raw materials carefully prepared and fermented, the next stage was arguably the most physically demanding and sonically defining of the entire papermaking process: the transformation of those softened fibers into a perfect, homogeneous pulp. This was not a gentle procedure. It was an act of controlled violence, a sustained assault on the plant matter until its very structure surrendered and dissolved into a milky suspension. Initially, this crucial step was achieved through sheer human muscle power. Workers would transfer the soaked mass of bark, rags, and hemp into large, heavy stone mortars. Then, wielding massive wooden mallets, they would begin a relentless, rhythmic pounding. For hours, the workshop would echo with the solid, percussive thud of wood striking stone, a monotonous yet vital soundtrack to creation. The goal was not merely to break the material apart, but to physically fray and separate each individual cellulose filament. Imagine trying to unravel a tangled ball of thousands of microscopic threads using only blunt force. That was the papermaker's task. This manual beating required immense stamina and a finely tuned judgment. The craftsman had to know precisely how long to pound too little, and the fibers would remain in clumps, resulting in a lumpy, weak sheet. Too much, and the fibers could be cut too short, producing a paper that was thin and lacked structural integrity. The true innovation in this brutal process came with the harnessing of nature's own power, a development that revolutionized the scale and consistency of paper production. Sometime during the medieval period, first in the Islamic world and later in Europe, papermakers began to replace the human arm with water-powered trip hammers. These ingenious mechanisms transformed a babbling stream into an industrial powerhouse. The system was elegant in its mechanics. A water wheel, turned by the current of a river or canal, would engage a series of cams on a rotating axle. As the axle turned, these cams would lift heavy wooden hammers, only to release them to fall with tremendous force into troughs filled with the fibrous material. This created a continuous, automated pounding that could operate day and night, tirelessly processing far greater quantities of pulp than any team of workers ever could. The constant, thunderous roar of these hammers became the signature sound of a paper mill, a sound so distinctive that mills were often located in isolated valleys, both for access to pure water and to distance the noise from populated areas. This shift from manual to mechanical pulping was a watershed moment. It didn't just ease the labor burden, it standardized the quality of the pulp. A water-powered hammer delivered the same force with every strike, creating a much more uniform slurry than even the most skilled human beater could consistently achieve. This technological leap was a key factor in paper's journey from a specialized craft product to a widely available commodity. The quality of this slurry, or stuff, as it was often called, was the single greatest determinant of the final paper's character. The papermaker judged its readiness not with a timer, but with his senses. He would scoop a handful from the vat and observe how the fibers were suspended in the water. The ideal pulp had a consistency akin to thin oatmeal or rich milk, clouding the water completely with a dense, even suspension of millions of microscopic fibers. He would also feel it between his fingers, assessing the length and separation of the individual strands. This tactile assessment was a critical skill. Long, well-separated fibers would create a strong, flexible sheet because they could form a dense, interlocking web as they dried. Each fiber is covered in tiny, hair-like fibrils, and during the beating process, these fibrils are activated, meaning they are roughened and made ready to form countless hydrogen bonds with their neighbors as the water drains away. It is this intricate, invisible web of bonds that gives a sheet of paper its strength, allowing it to be folded, rolled, and handled without disintegrating. The texture of the finished product was also born in the pulp vat. A coarser, less beaten pulp would result in a rougher, more absorbent sheet, often desirable for artists seeking a certain tooth for their charcoal or pastels. A longer, more refined beating produced a finer, denser, and smoother sheet, perfectly suited for the flowing strokes of a calligrapher's brush or the sharp impression of metal type. In this way, the papermaker was not just making a generic material. He was, at this very stage, engineering the specific personality of every single sheet that would later emerge from his mold. But even with the perfect pulp and a masterful technique for forming sheets, the papermaker's work was not yet complete. The freshly dried sheet, known as a waterleaf, was still fundamentally a delicate, porous mat of plant fibers. If you were to dip a brush in ink and try to write on it, the result would be a disaster. The liquid would spread uncontrollably, bleeding along the fibers in ugly, feathered strokes, making crisp calligraphy or precise characters impossible. The paper was simply too absorbent. To transform this humble substrate into a surface worthy of recording sacred texts and imperial decrees, ancient artisans had to perform one final act of chemical wizardry. They had to introduce a secret ingredient, a process known as sizing. This was the final, crucial barrier that made paper truly functional for writing, and the specific recipes for these sizing agents were among the most closely guarded secrets of the craft. The primary goal of sizing was deceptively simple: to fill the microscopic pores between the cellulose fibers, creating a controlled, non-absorbent surface that would repel ink just enough to keep it on the surface, allowing it to dry in a sharp, clean line. The earliest and most common sizing agent was starch, typically derived from rice or wheat. The process was meticulous. The papermaker would create a thin, soupy paste by boiling the starch in water. Then, either the entire, freshly formed sheet would be dipped into a vat of this warm sizing solution, or the solution would be brushed directly onto the surface of sheets that had already been partially dried. The starch would penetrate the paper's matrix, coating the individual fibers and filling the voids between them. When the paper was dried again, the starch would harden, creating a smooth, sealed surface. This internal sizing, as it's called, fundamentally changed the paper's relationship with ink. Instead of being sucked in like water into a sponge, the ink would now sit on the surface, its pigments bonding as it slowly evaporated, leaving behind the precise intention of the writer's brushstroke. This was the difference between a blurry smudge and a work of art. For an even higher quality, more luxurious finish, papermakers turned to a different protein-based agent, animal gelatin. This was often made by boiling animal hides, bones, or connective tissues, a process that extracted collagen and turned it into a strong, sticky glue. Gelatin sizing was typically applied as a surface treatment. Sheets of paper were brushed with the warm liquid gelatin or hung and sized by dipping them in a gelatin bath, a method that created a very fine, hard coating on the topmost layer. The result was an exceptionally smooth, glossy, and resilient writing surface. Ink applied to gelatin-sized paper would sit almost perfectly on top, yielding unbelievably crisp and sharp lines that were highly prized by court calligraphers and for important documents. However, this luxury came with a vulnerability. Because gelatin is organic, it is a delicious food source for insects and microorganisms. Many ancient books and scrolls that were sized with gelatin show the telltale signs of insect damage, tiny holes and tunnels where bookworms and other pests have feasted on the nutritious coating over the centuries. This creates a fascinating paradox for historians and conservators. The very process that made these documents so beautiful and functional for writing also made them inherently delicious to other forms of life, threatening their long-term preservation. Beyond these organic solutions, evidence suggests that some papermakers experimented with even more advanced mineral additives to achieve specific effects. Fine, white mineral powders, such as gypsum or chalk, known collectively as whiting, were sometimes added to the pulp slurry or used as a coating. These minerals served a dual purpose. First, they acted as a filler, making the paper more opaque and providing a brighter, whiter background that enhanced the contrast of black ink, a significant improvement over the naturally off-white or tan color of untreated hemp and mulberry paper. Second, they contributed to the smoothness and weight of the sheet, giving it a more substantial, luxurious feel. In some cases, particularly in later periods and in other papermaking traditions, materials like Cai Lun clay were used to create an exceptionally smooth, porcelain-like finish ideal for printing and painting. The use of these mineral additives demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of material science. These ancient craftsmen weren't just making a surface to write on, they were engineering its visual appeal, its tactile quality, and its functional performance. The development and application of sizing was what truly separated utilitarian wrapping paper from refined writing paper. It was the final, defining step that elevated the material from a simple commodity to an intellectual tool. A sheet without sizing was like an unpaved road, rough, unpredictable, and difficult to traverse with precision. A properly sized sheet, however, was like a smooth, well-maintained highway, allowing ideas to travel quickly and clearly from the mind of the writer to the eye of the reader. This attention to the surface quality reveals the papermakers' deep respect for the ultimate purpose of their product. They understood that they were not merely creating a physical object, but a medium for communication, for art, and for permanence. The secret alchemy of starch, gelatin, and minerals was the final enchantment in the process, the spell that turned a fragile web of plant fibers into a timeless canvas for human thought. While we rightly celebrate paper as the bedrock of literature and bureaucracy, its journey began in far more humble and surprising corners of daily life. The ancient Chinese, in their characteristic ingenuity, saw in this new material a universe of possibilities that extended far beyond the scholar's desk. One of the most intimate and revealing applications was its use as toilet paper. Historical records from the Tang Dynasty, specifically from the travels of an Arab merchant who visited China in the 9th century, note with astonishment that the Chinese did not use water for cleansing, but instead used paper. Even earlier, in the 6th century, a scholar named Yan Zhitui wrote explicitly about the importance of never using paper with quotations from the 5 classics, the core Confucian texts, for such a purpose. This distinction is profoundly telling. It shows that by this time, paper was already so commonplace and produced in such varying grades of quality that it could be categorized. There was fine, white paper reserved for sacred texts and important documents, and then there was coarse, cheap paper deemed perfectly suitable for this most basic human need. This everyday use speaks volumes about paper's affordability and its seamless integration into the fabric of ordinary life, serving the body as readily as it served the mind. The versatility of paper stretched from the privy to the person, quite literally, as it was ingeniously fashioned into clothing and accessories. While you wouldn't weave a paper shirt in the same way you'd weave silk or hemp, artisans developed a remarkable technique of layering and treating paper to create a durable, flexible, and surprisingly warm textile substitute. Multiple sheets of strong, long-fibered paper, often from the paper mulberry tree, would be laminated together using natural adhesives, and then cut and sewn into garments. These were not merely novelty items. They were practical solutions for monks, the poor, and even soldiers who needed an extra layer of insulation. Historical accounts describe paper robes and caps being worn by Buddhist monks, who valued the material's simplicity and humble origins. This paper clothing was also remarkably functional in rainy climates. While it wouldn't be fully waterproof, the laminated layers could offer some protection from a light drizzle, and when it eventually wore out, it was far easier and cheaper to replace than a woven cloth garment. Beyond robes, paper was also used to make sturdy, lightweight shoes and belts, demonstrating a comprehensive approach to dressing the body with this most adaptable of materials. Perhaps one of the most startling military applications was the use of paper as a form of armor. While it sounds like a fatal flaw, the reality was a brilliant piece of engineering that exploited paper's unique properties. Chinese artisans created a type of armored vest by taking many, many layers of thick, tough paper and compressing them tightly together, often with a fabric covering. This resulting material, known as paper carton, was remarkably resilient. Its strength came from the same principle that gives modern cardboard its rigidity. The millions of interlocked cellulose fibers create a dense, matted web that is difficult to pierce. When an arrow or a blade struck this compressed paper armor, the force was dissipated across the vast, tangled network of fibers, blunting the impact. It was also incredibly light compared to metal plate armor or even heavy quilted textiles, allowing for greater mobility on the battlefield. Furthermore, it had a hidden advantage in wet weather. While metal armor could rust and become cumbersome, and leather could become heavy and stiff when soaked, paper armor could be treated with lacquers or oils to provide a degree of water resistance. This innovation highlights a deep understanding of material science, transforming a seemingly fragile substance into a form of life-saving protection. The translucency and affordability of paper also made it a revolutionary material for architecture, particularly as a window covering, before the widespread use of glass, which was incredibly expensive and difficult to produce in large, flat sheets. People across the world used a variety of materials to cover window openings, from oiled cloth to thin sheets of animal horn. In China, paper provided a perfect solution. A wooden lattice window frame could be covered with a sheet of durable, translucent paper, often oiled to enhance its weather resistance. This allowed soft, diffused light to flood into a room, creating a warm, serene atmosphere while providing privacy and protection from the wind. This application was so successful and beloved that it became a defining aesthetic feature of East Asian architecture for centuries, from humble rural homes to the pavilions of imperial palaces. The paper window was a perfect marriage of form and function, a simple technology that profoundly shaped the experience of domestic space, making interiors brighter and more inviting. Finally, the artistic and decorative spirit found a perfect medium in paper. It became the foundation for a stunning array of objects that blended utility with beauty. The invention of the paper lantern, for instance, transformed the night by stretching paper over a collapsible bamboo frame and placing a candle inside. The Chinese created a source of portable, safe, and beautiful illumination. These lanterns could be carried in processions, hung outside shops and homes, and released into the sky, their gentle glow turning practical light into public celebration and private ambience. Similarly, the paper fan became an essential accessory, a tool for comfort that also served as a canvas for exquisite calligraphy and painting. A folding fan made of paper and bamboo was lightweight, could be easily carried, and when opened, presented a personal work of art. These were not minor novelties. They were cultural artifacts that expressed social status, personal taste, and artistic sensibility. From the fierce practicality of armor to the delicate beauty of a painted fan, paper demonstrated an almost chameleon-like ability to adapt to every conceivable human need, proving that its true revolution lay not in any single purpose, but in its boundless versatility. Yet, for all our discussion of paper's origins and its slow journey westward, nothing could have prepared the world for the sheer magnitude of what was waiting, forgotten, in a remote Chinese desert. For centuries, the Baqiao caves near the oasis town of Dunhuang served as a bustling spiritual and cultural crossroads on the Silk Road. Hundreds of temples and shrines were carved into a long cliff face, their walls covered in breathtaking Buddhist murals, a testament to the piety and wealth of passing merchants and pilgrims. But by the early 20th century, many of these caves had fallen into disrepair, their entrances often choked with desert sand. It was in this setting that an unlikely figure, a Taoist monk named Wang Yunlu, who had appointed himself the site's caretaker, made a discovery that would rewrite history. In the year 1900, while supervising the clearing of sand from one of the caverns, he noticed a crack in a wall mural. Investigating further, he tapped on the wall and heard a hollow echo. Behind what was a false, sealed wall, he found a hidden chamber, no larger than a small room, and it was packed from floor to ceiling with an unimaginable treasure. This was not a hoard of gold or jewels, but something far more precious, a time capsule made entirely of paper. The contents of what became known as Library Cave Number 17 were staggering. It wasn't just a few dozen scrolls. It was a comprehensive archive of an entire millennium of Silk Road life, meticulously preserved by the dry desert air. Estimates suggest the small chamber contained upwards of 50,000 individual items. There were delicate Buddhist sutras copied onto long paper scrolls, some beautifully illustrated with vibrant colors. There were Nestorian Christian scriptures and Manichaean hymns, showing the incredible religious diversity that flowed through this hub. There were government documents, contracts for the sale of a camel, private letters filled with family gossip, vocabulary lists for travelers trying to learn new languages, and even students' practice sheets with clumsy characters. This was not a curated library of important works. It was a chaotic, magnificent jumble of the everyday and the sacred, the official and the deeply personal. For historians, it was like finding a perfectly preserved city where every single piece of mail, every book, and every notepad from a 1,000-year period had been saved. The dry climate of Dunhuang acted as a perfect natural preservative, preventing the paper from rotting or being eaten by insects, leaving the ink on these manuscripts as sharp and legible as the day they were penned. The timing of the cave's sealing adds another layer of mystery and drama to the find. Scholars believe it was sealed up around the beginning of the 11th century, a time when the Dunhuang region was under threat from an expanding Tangut Empire. The prevailing theory is that the monks of the Baqiao caves, facing an imminent invasion, made the difficult decision to protect their most precious and irreplaceable texts. They gathered this colossal collection from their monastic libraries, and perhaps from the wider community, carefully walled it up inside this forgotten chamber, and then fled, presumably hoping to return one day to reclaim their spiritual and intellectual heritage. That day never came. The secret of the library cave died with those who hid it, and for 900 years it sat in perfect silence and darkness, its existence completely unknown to the outside world. This act of preservation, born from fear and conflict, inadvertently created the single most important collection for the study of medieval Asia, saving these fragile paper documents from the certain destruction they would have faced through war, looting, or simply the slow decay of time. The discovery of the Dunhuang Library Cave fundamentally reshaped entire fields of scholarship. Before its unsealing, much of our understanding of Chinese and Central Asian history came from official dynastic records, which were often written by the victors and focused on emperors, wars, and grand court politics. The Dunhuang manuscripts provided a deafening chorus of voices from below. They gave us the mundane details of taxation, the legal disputes over property, the shopping lists of merchants, and the heartfelt prayers of common people. This paper trail offered an unprecedented, ground-level view of how society actually functioned, how religions coexisted and influenced one another, and how goods and ideas were traded along the Silk Road. It confirmed the existence of texts that were thought to be lost forever and revealed entirely new branches of literature and philosophy. The diversity of languages found in the cave was itself a revelation, including not only Chinese but also Tibetan, Sanskrit, Uyghur, Sogdian, and even Hebrew, painting a vibrant picture of a truly cosmopolitan world where cultures met and merged on paper. The story of the cave's contents after their discovery is a complex and often painful chapter of colonial archaeology and cultural loss. Wang Yuanlu, the monk who found the cave, did not have the resources or the scholarly background to understand the global significance of what he had uncovered. He began to offer manuscripts to local officials in exchange for donations to fund his restoration work at the caves. News of the find eventually reached Western explorers, such as the Hungarian-British archaeologist Aurel Stein and the French philologist Paul Pelliot, who arrived at Dunhuang in the early 20th century. They recognized the immense value of the collection immediately and, through negotiations with Wang, acquired tens of thousands of manuscripts for a relative pittance, shipping them back to institutions in London, Paris, and later, other parts of the world. While these actions preserved the documents from potential local neglect and made them available for international study, they also represented a massive removal of cultural heritage from China, a source of enduring controversy and scholarly reckoning to this day. The dispersal of the Dunhuang Library across the globe, however, also had the effect of creating an entire new academic discipline, Dunhuangology, as scholars from many nations worked to piece together this giant, scattered jigsaw puzzle of human history, all written on that most humble and enduring of materials, paper. This very question opens up a fascinating detective story in the history of paper, one that pits the overt symbolism of the West against the subtle, almost secretive markings of the East. In Europe, the watermark is an unmistakable signature, created by a wire design sewn onto the papermaking mold. It leaves a translucent impression in the finished sheet, boldly declaring the papermaker's identity, the mill's location, or the paper's quality standard for all to see. It was a public declaration of origin, a brand in the most literal sense. But when we turn our gaze to the vast corpus of ancient Chinese paper, we find no such obvious, standardized symbols. There are no elegant fleur-de-lis, no detailed coats of arms peering out from between the fibers. This absence has long led to the assumption that Chinese paper was anonymous, a blank slate without a maker's mark. Yet, to assume there is no signature simply because it isn't shouted is to misunderstand the quiet language of Chinese craftsmanship. The marks are there, but they speak in a whisper, requiring a different kind of literacy to decipher. The Chinese equivalent to the watermark was not a pictorial symbol, but a tactile and visual texture woven into the very foundation of the sheet. The most telling of these hidden signatures was the mold impression itself. Remember the crucial tool, the mold and decal. The screen stretched across the mold was traditionally woven from fine bamboo strips, or, for the most luxurious papers, delicate silk threads. The pattern of this weave, the specific spacing and thickness of these threads, left a permanent, subtle ghost image embedded in every single sheet of paper produced on that particular mold. To the untrained eye, these are just faint lines, but to a connoisseur or a historian, they are as distinctive as a fingerprint. A sheet from a mill in Jinxian, famous for its Xushuan paper, would have a different weave pattern and thread spacing than a sheet produced in Fujian. These chain lines and laid lines, as they are technically known, became an unintentional but highly consistent identifier of a specific workshop's equipment. Over time, as a mold wore out and was replaced, the pattern might change slightly, creating a chronological record that allows experts to date papers with remarkable precision. This was a signature born not from intent, but from the unique physical character of the tool itself, a passive yet powerful marker of origin. Beyond the weave of the screen, papermakers employed another ingenious, albeit less consistent method of marking their work, the use of impressed seals. Unlike the European watermark, which is formed during the sheet's creation, these were often applied after the paper was made, while it was still slightly damp and pressed in stacks. A craftsman might press a carved wooden or stone seal, bearing the name of the workshop, the master papermaker, or even an auspicious phrase, directly onto the surface of a stack of finished sheets. This would leave a slight, embossed impression on the top few sheets. These impressions are often incredibly subtle, visible only when the paper is held at a sharp angle to the light, revealing a shallow depression where the fibers were compacted. They were not meant for public display in the way a watermark was. They were more akin to an internal quality control stamp or a mark of pride for the artisan, a quiet boast of craftsmanship meant for those who handled the paper directly, from the merchant to the discerning scholar who would ultimately write upon it. Finding such a seal is a rare and exciting event for historians, as it provides a direct, verifiable link to a specific time, place, and often, a specific person. The philosophy behind this subtlety is deeply rooted in the cultural context. In the European guild system, a watermark was a legal and commercial necessity. It protected a mill's reputation, guaranteed quality to buyers, and could be used to settle trade disputes. It was a public-facing brand. In contrast, the world of elite Chinese paper was often built on personal relationships and imperial patronage. A scholar or a court official wouldn't buy paper from a random merchant. They would commission it directly from a renowned workshop with a centuries-old reputation. The quality of the paper, its texture, its responsiveness to the brush, its longevity, was its own advertisement. The maker's identity was known through word of mouth and tradition, not through a visible logo on the product. The mark of quality was in the performance of the material itself. A master calligrapher could feel the origin of a sheet by the way his brush glided across its sized surface, or how the ink was absorbed without bleeding. In this culture, a loud, obvious watermark might have been seen as vulgar, a distraction from the pure, unadorned beauty of the sheet and the art it was meant to carry. The signature was in the sublime experience, not in a symbol. This doesn't mean the Chinese were unaware of the concept of proprietary marks. In fact, for certain specialized papers, particularly those produced under imperial commission, the control was absolute. The finest papers, destined for the emperor's brush or for recording sacred Buddhist sutras, were sometimes embedded with secret security features. There are accounts of papers having colored threads, tiny flecks of precious material, or distinctive, almost imperceptible color tints mixed in the pulp. These were not marks for public recognition, but for authentication. They were a way for court officials to verify that the paper being used for a crucial edict was the genuine article, produced by the sanctioned imperial workshop, and not a cheap imitation. Unraveling a document to find a single embedded crimson silk thread would be a definitive proof of its origin and importance. This approach reflects a different priority, not public branding, but controlled authentication, a secret handshake between the maker and the most elite user. So, while the Chinese may not have had watermarks as Europe defined them, they developed a rich, complex, and often beautifully subtle vocabulary of marks that served the same essential purposes, identifying origin, guaranteeing quality, and preventing forgery. They simply spoke their own quiet language, one that we are only now learning to hear. The widespread availability of refined paper set the stage for another innovation that would amplify its power a thousandfold, a technology that would harness the physical consistency of the sheet to replicate thought itself, woodblock printing. This revolutionary process emerged during the Tang Dynasty, a golden age of cultural flourishing, and it was a perfect marriage of medium and method. While paper provided the ideal canvas, smooth, absorbent, and strong enough to withstand the pressure of a press, it was the woodblock that provided the voice, allowing a single idea to be stamped onto countless sheets, creating a chorus of identical copies where before there had only been solitary, handwritten whispers. The process was deceptively simple in its genius. A calligrapher would first write the text, often a page from a Buddhist sutra or a classical text, in reverse directly onto a perfectly planed block of fine-grained wood, typically from a pear or jujube tree. Then, a master carver would use sharp knives and gouges to meticulously cut away the wood around the inked characters, leaving the text standing in sharp reverse relief. The raised characters now stood ready, a mirror image of the final page, waiting to be inked and pressed onto a blank sheet of paper. This elegant system transformed the economics and speed of book production. Before woodblock printing, the creation of a book was an act of immense, painstaking labor. A single scribe might spend months or even years copying a lengthy text by hand, their progress measured in characters per day. Every copy was unique, subject to the scribe's individual handwriting style, fatigue, and potential for error. With a carved woodblock, however, the entire dynamic shifted. Once the initial, labor-intensive carving was complete, the block could be used to produce hundreds, even thousands, of near-identical impressions. An entire page could be printed in a matter of seconds. A team of workers could operate an assembly line, one applying ink to the raised surface of the block with a brush, another carefully placing a sheet of paper over it, a third using a dry brush or a padded tool to rub the back of the sheet to ensure a clean, even transfer of ink, and a fourth peeling the finished print away to dry. This was the world's first true method of mass communication, a system that turned the art of bookmaking from a bespoke craft into a scalable industry, dramatically lowering the cost of books and making written knowledge accessible to a far broader segment of society than ever before. The ultimate testament to the power of this paper and wood partnership is the Diamond Sutra, a Chinese translation of a sacred Buddhist text created in the year 868. Discovered in the sealed library cave at Dunhuang, this scroll is not merely an ancient document. It holds the distinguished title of the world's oldest dated printed book. The scroll itself is a masterpiece of integrated technology. It consists of 7 separate sheets of sturdy, high-quality paper, each printed from its own meticulously carved woodblock, which were then joined together to form a single, continuous scroll over 16 feet long. The frontispiece, an intricate illustration showing the Buddha surrounded by disciples and celestial beings, demonstrates an artistic sophistication that proves woodblock printing was already a mature art form by this time. And at the end, a colophon plainly states its purpose and its origin. Reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Jai on behalf of his 2 parents. This inscription is profoundly revealing. It shows that printing was already being used for an act of religious merit, with the explicit goal of universal free distribution, a concept that depended entirely on the ability to create multiple, affordable copies. The Diamond Sutra is not a prototype. It is a fully realized product of an established print culture, a silent witness to a revolution already in progress. The primary engine driving this early print revolution was the spread of Buddhism. The faith's emphasis on gaining merit through the copying and dissemination of sacred texts created a massive, sustained demand for sutras. For a devout Buddhist, sponsoring the carving of a woodblock to print thousands of copies of a scripture was an act of immense spiritual Chinese letter, or merit, far surpassing what could be achieved by commissioning a single handwritten copy. This religious incentive provided the economic and social fuel for the printing industry to develop and refine its techniques. Monasteries became early centers of printing production, with monks often involved in the carving, inking, and distribution processes. The texts they produced ranged from short charms and prayers, which could be printed on small slips of paper and carried as talismans, to massive, multi-volume canon of Buddhist teachings. This religious imperative ensured a constant market for paper and a continuous refinement of the printing craft, creating a virtuous cycle where spiritual devotion fostered technological advancement, which in turn allowed that devotion to spread faster and wider than ever before. Yet the impact of woodblock printing swiftly expanded beyond the monastery walls, permeating the secular world and transforming everyday life. The Tang government recognized its utility for standardizing and disseminating official information, using printed sheets for administrative manuals, calendars, and even edicts. For the burgeoning merchant class, printing provided a tool for commerce in the form of advertising flyers, contracts, and rudimentary paper money. Perhaps one of the most relatable applications was in the realm of popular culture. Printed sheets featuring popular poetry, folktales, and illustrations became affordable commodities for a newly literate urban populace. Imagine a resident of the Tang capital, Chang'an, browsing a market stall and purchasing a cheap printed sheet with a famous poem, or a beautifully rendered image of a mythical beast to display in their home. This was the birth of mass media, the moment when art and literature began to escape the exclusive confines of the elite and enter the sphere of popular enjoyment. The combination of paper and woodblock printing didn't just replicate existing knowledge. It actively created a new, more democratic cultural landscape where ideas, both sacred and profane, could circulate with unprecedented freedom and speed, knitting together the vast empire with a shared printed word. When we admire an ancient manuscript, we're captivated by the words and images, not the environmental cost of its creation. Yet, the story of paper is also a story about humanity's relationship with natural resources, a complex balance between ingenious sustainability and significant industrial impact. To ask if ancient papermaking was eco-friendly is to step into a world without our modern concepts of pollution or conservation, where practices were judged by their efficiency and longevity, not their carbon footprint. On one hand, the system displayed a remarkable, almost circular economy. The foundational ingredients were not virgin forests, but the waste streams of other industries. Old hemp ropes, frayed fishing nets, and tattered cloth rags were not trash. They were a harvest carefully collected and given a second life. This wasn't recycling in the modern municipal sense. It was a pragmatic form of upcycling deeply embedded in a culture that saw value in what others discarded. The cultivation of paper mulberry trees was itself a model of sustainable agroforestry. These trees were not clear-cut from wild forests. They were specifically cultivated in plantations, often grown on hillsides unsuitable for other crops, and they were harvested in a way that allowed the tree to regenerate. Workers would carefully strip the long, fibrous inner bark, leaving the core of the tree alive to grow a new layer for the following year. This coppicing technique ensured a continuous, renewable supply of raw material for generations, a stark contrast to the clear cutting that would characterize later paper industries in other parts of the world. The primary fiber source, hemp, further reinforced this sustainable profile. Hemp is a remarkably resilient plant, growing quickly in poor soils with minimal need for pesticides or extensive watering. Its deep root system actually helped to prevent soil erosion, and its dense growth could suppress weeds naturally. A single acre of hemp could yield several times more fiber than an acre of trees over the same period. This efficiency meant that papermakers could support a massive industry without requiring vast, unsustainable tracts of land. The entire procurement model was built on abundance and renewability. By relying on fast-growing plants like hemp and mulberry, and by incorporating post-consumer waste like rags and nets, the ancient paper industry created a supply chain that was, for its time, incredibly lean and resource-conscious. It was a system that understood its dependence on the natural world and organized itself to work within those cycles, not against them. This careful management of resources was a key reason why paper production could flourish for centuries without collapsing its own resource base. However, this seemingly green picture has a much darker, murkier side when we look at the manufacturing process itself, particularly its relationship with water. Papermaking is an incredibly water-intensive endeavor. From the initial retting or fermentation of the raw materials to the final rinsing of the pulp and the cleaning of the equipment, every stage required enormous quantities of fresh, clean water. A single workshop might consume thousands of gallons in a single day. This created a powerful geographical imperative. Paper mills had to be located directly on the banks of fast-flowing rivers or streams. The water was not just a raw material. It was the very medium of production, the vehicle that carried the fibers from a tangled mass to a unified sheet. But what happened to the water after it was used? The pulping vats and fermentation pits were filled with a toxic soup of organic waste, residual lime used for cleaning, and the broken down non-fibrous parts of the plants, known as lignins and pectins. This contaminated water was almost always simply released back into the river, downstream from the mill's fresh water intake. We can only imagine the local environmental impact. A thriving papermaking center with dozens of workshops lining a single river would have turned the waterway into an open industrial sewer. The high biological oxygen demand of the organic waste would have sucked the oxygen out of the water, creating dead zones where fish and other aquatic life could not survive. The water would have run brown and foul-smelling for miles downstream. While there are no Environmental Protection Agency reports from the Tang Dynasty, we can find clues in historical complaints and local folklore. There are scattered accounts from villages downstream of major papermaking centers describing rivers that were undrinkable and unfit for irrigation, their banks lined with the rotting, smelly sludge left behind when the water receded. This points to a significant, localized pollution problem, a classic example of an externality where the cost of production was borne not by the manufacturer, but by the community and ecosystem downstream. The very purity of the water source was essential for making high-quality paper, yet the industry's operations actively destroyed that purity, creating a tragic paradox at the heart of its success. The industry's energy demands also present a mixed picture. The initial stages, like pounding the pulp with heavy mallets, were brutally labor-intensive, powered by human muscle. This had a low environmental impact, but a very high human cost. The great innovation of water-powered trip hammers, which emerged later in China and became standard in medieval European mills, dramatically increased production capacity. This harnessed a renewable energy source, the flowing river, replacing human toil with mechanical force. It was a clean energy solution in one sense, but it also intensified the industry's footprint. Building dams and channels to control water flow for the mills could alter local hydrology, affecting fish migration and sediment flow. Furthermore, the sheer increase in production volume made possible by water power meant that more raw materials were consumed and more polluted water was discharged. A technological solution that solved one problem, human labor, often exacerbated another environmental scale. The final stage of production, drying the paper, was generally low impact, relying on the sun and wind in large drying lofts or on heated walls. The entire life cycle, from a renewable plant to a sun-dried sheet, was bookended by natural processes, but the industrial core of pulping and processing remained a voracious consumer and polluter of water. When we compare this ancient system to the environmental challenges of modern paper production, the contrasts and surprising parallels become clear. The modern industry is defined by its scale and its reliance on wood pulp, leading to massive deforestation, particularly of old-growth forests. The chemical pulping processes used to break down tough wood fibers involve toxic compounds like chlorine, creating dioxins, some of the most potent pollutants ever synthesized by industry. The ancient system, by relying on softer, non-wood fibers like hemp and mulberry, avoided this chemical nightmare. Their mechanical and fermentation-based pulping was far less toxic, even if the organic pollution was severe. The ancient practice of using recycled rags is a direct ancestor of our modern recycled paper movement, a recognition that the most sustainable fiber is the one that's already been harvested. Yet, the ancient world lacked any concept of wastewater treatment. Today, while problems persist, modern mills are subject to regulations and have sophisticated systems to treat their effluent before releasing it. The ancient papermaker, for all his ingenuity, simply let the river carry his waste away, solving his immediate problem while creating a legacy of localized environmental degradation. Ultimately, the ancient paper industry was a paradox of sustainability. It was built on a brilliantly renewable and recycled supply chain, a model that modern environmentalists would applaud. But its manufacturing heart was a brutal, polluting process that consumed and contaminated a vital resource on a massive scale. It shows us that even our most celebrated historical innovations rarely come without a hidden cost, a reminder that progress in any age is almost always a compromise between human ambition and the enduring limits of the natural world. Imagine the challenge of governing a territory that stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the coast of the South China Sea, a realm of such immense scale that a message from the capital could take months to reach its farthest provinces. For the Han Dynasty and every major Chinese empire that followed, this was not an abstract problem but a daily administrative reality. The sheer survival of these vast states depended on a constant, reliable flow of information, and it was paper that became the silent, indispensable circulatory system for this imperial body. Before its widespread adoption, the bureaucracy was choked by the physical weight of its own records. Imperial edicts carved onto heavy bamboo slats or written on precious, costly silk simply could not keep pace with the needs of a growing, complex state. The arrival of cheap, lightweight, and durable paper changed everything, transforming the very nature of governance and turning the Chinese imperial bureaucracy into the most sophisticated administrative machine the ancient world had ever seen. The most immediate and powerful application was for imperial edicts and decrees. When the emperor spoke, his words now had wings. A single authoritative copy of a new law or a military order could be written on paper and then replicated by scribes into dozens, even hundreds, of identical copies for distribution across the empire. These documents were not mere suggestions. They were the binding will of the state, and their physical form mattered. The paper used was often of a specific high quality, sometimes even tinged with a yellow dye derived from the pagoda tree, a color reserved for the emperor himself. This visual cue immediately signaled the document's authority to any official who received it. A governor in a distant province, unrolling a yellow-tinted paper scroll, would understand its supreme importance without reading a single character. The portability of paper meant that these crucial commands could travel with imperial messengers swiftly and in large numbers, ensuring that a new tax policy or a directive for a public works project could be implemented with a consistency that was previously unimaginable. The empire, once a collection of semi-autonomous regions, was now being woven together by a continuous thread of paper directives emanating from the center. Beyond the grand pronouncements, it was in the unglamorous, meticulous work of record-keeping that paper truly proved its revolutionary worth. The lifeblood of any state is information about its people and its resources, and the Chinese bureaucracy became voracious consumers of data. The most monumental of these efforts was the national census. For the first time, officials could undertake the staggering task of counting every single household and individual across the empire. Agents would travel to every village, registering the names, ages, and occupations of the inhabitants on standardized paper forms. This was not a one-time event. Censuses were conducted with remarkable regularity, creating a dynamic, updating picture of the entire population. The resulting archives, compiled from thousands of these local reports, allowed the central government to understand demographic trends, track the movement of people, and, most crucially, identify every eligible citizen for taxation and conscription into the army or for massive corvée labor projects. The empire now knew its own strength in precise numerical terms, and it was all because a scribe in a remote county could fill out a form on a sheet of paper instead of struggling with a cartload of bamboo. This data directly fed into the empire's financial engine, the tax system. Paper enabled a level of bureaucratic granularity that was simply impossible before. Detailed tax rolls were maintained for every district, listing each household's obligations, whether in grain, cloth, or coin. These were not simple lists. They were complex ledgers that recorded payments made, arrears owed, and exemptions granted. A local magistrate could cross-reference a farmer's claim of a poor harvest with past tax records stored in his office, all contained in manageable paper binders. This created a powerful system of accountability, both for the taxpayer and for the tax collector. It became far more difficult for local officials to embezzle funds or impose arbitrary taxes when their actions were documented in a paper trail that could be audited by inspectors from the capital. The infamous paperwork of modern government finds its ancient ancestor here, in the Han Dynasty tax office, where clerks spent their days ensuring the empire's coffers were filled by meticulously tracking every transaction on endless reams of paper. The day-to-day administration of the empire generated a constant hum of official correspondence, all of it conducted on paper. Provincial governors submitted annual reports on the state of their territories, detailing agricultural yields, local weather conditions, and any signs of unrest. Military commanders sent dispatches about troop movements and border incidents. Judges forwarded records of major legal cases for review. This created a continuous, two-way conversation between the center and the periphery. An official in the capital, sitting in a ministry, could have on his desk reports from the tropical south, the arid northwest, and the fertile central plains, all within easy reach. He could compare, analyze, and synthesize information on a scale that would have been mind-boggling to a Roman administrator struggling with bulky papyrus scrolls. This flow of information allowed for a more responsive and informed central government. A famine in one region could be met with grain shipments from a surplus region, all coordinated through paper missives. A corrupt official could be investigated based on evidence compiled from dozens of paper documents. The empire was no longer a distant, abstract concept to its subjects. It was a tangible presence whose will and welfare were mediated through the written word on paper. This immense bureaucratic machine required a new kind of person to run it, the scholar official, selected through the famed imperial examination system. And here, paper played a dual role. It was both the medium for the exams themselves and the subject matter that the candidates had to master. Aspirants spent years memorizing the Confucian classics and practicing their calligraphy and essay composition, all on paper. The examination halls were vast spaces where thousands of men would sit in individual cells, writing their answers on provided paper booklets for days on end. The very existence of this merit-based system, which theoretically allowed any man of talent to rise to the highest levels of government, was predicated on the cheap availability of paper for both education and examination. Once these men passed the exams and entered government service, their entire professional lives revolved around paper. They became the architects and custodians of the very system that had elevated them, drafting reports, writing memoranda, and archiving documents. Their legacy is the vast corpus of administrative records that have survived, a paper trail of history written not by emperors or generals, but by the anonymous civil servants who kept the machinery of state functioning for centuries. The ultimate expression of this bureaucratic obsession with record keeping is the fact that we know about it at all. The Chinese imperial courts had a tradition of compiling official histories for each dynasty, massive projects undertaken by teams of historians who sifted through the mountains of paperwork generated by the previous regime. They had access to daily court diaries, ministerial reports, tax records, and imperial edicts, an almost incomprehensibly detailed archive of government activity, all on paper. This practice created an unbroken historical record of unparalleled length and depth. When we read about a policy debate in the Tang court or the budget for a Song Dynasty irrigation project, we are accessing information that was meticulously documented by contemporary bureaucrats for their own administrative purposes. The paper trail they left behind is not just a metaphor. It is a literal, physical chain of documents that connects us directly to the inner workings of an ancient empire. This bureaucratic impulse, enabled by paper, did more than just manage a state. It actively wrote its history, ensuring that the decisions, the triumphs, and the failures of its government would not be lost to time, but would be preserved for future generations to study, learn from, and marvel at. This transformation from a utilitarian wrapping material to a sublime artistic medium represents one of paper's most profound cultural leaps. It moved from protecting objects to expressing the human soul, and this evolution was driven by the unique demands of China's most revered art forms, calligraphy and painting. For the Chinese scholar-artist, the brush, the ink, the inkstone, and the paper were known collectively as the four treasures of the study, and of these, paper was perhaps the most crucial and sensitive partner. It wasn't a passive surface waiting to be filled. It was an active participant in the creative act. A master calligrapher didn't merely write on paper, he conducted a dialogue with it. The paper's texture, its absorbency, its color, and even its faint scent would influence the flow of ink, the character of each brushstroke, and ultimately, the very spirit of the finished work. Choosing the right paper was as deliberate and meaningful as choosing the right words. The most legendary of these artistic papers is Xuan paper, a name that still commands reverence among artists today. Originating from Jing County in Anhui Province, which was historically part of Xuan Prefecture, this paper was the result of a perfect storm of local conditions and perfected craft. Its primary fiber came from the blue sandalwood tree, a slow-growing plant that provided long, tough fibers mixed with rice straw. This specific combination, processed in the pure waters of the local mountains, created a sheet that was deceptively soft yet incredibly strong, capable of lasting for over 1,000 years without yellowing or becoming brittle. But its true magic lay in its performance. Xuan paper is what artists call absorbent but not leaking. When a brush loaded with ink touches its surface, the paper drinks in the liquid, allowing the ink to spread slightly in a beautiful, feathering effect that softens the edges of each stroke. This quality, known as shangshuan or raw xuan, allows the ink to sink into the fiber matrix, creating a depth and richness that makes the characters feel as if they are emerging from within the paper itself, rather than sitting on top of it. For a different kind of control, artists could turn to shakshuan or processed xuan. This paper underwent an additional step where a sizing agent, like alum, was applied to its surface. This treatment made the paper less absorbent, causing the ink to pool and dry on the surface. This was ideal for the Gongbai style of painting, which required precise, detailed lines with sharp boundaries and layers of color. The artist could achieve incredibly fine, controlled strokes without any of the bleeding or spreading that characterize the more expressive, spontaneous styles. This duality within a single paper tradition, the raw and the processed, showcases the papermaker's deep understanding of the artist's needs. They weren't just making paper. They were engineering different kinds of creative experiences, providing a spectrum of surfaces that could accommodate everything from the wild, impulsive energy of cursive script to the painstaking detail of a courtly portrait. Beyond its functional performance, paper was also a visual object in its own right, and papermakers elevated their craft to an art form through color and texture. The poetic names given to these papers are a testament to the cultural imagination they inspired. Cicada wing paper was a famously thin, translucent, and incredibly delicate sheet. Holding it up to the light, it had the ethereal quality of a cicada's wing, its faint golden brown hue allowing text to be read from both sides. It was the epitome of refined elegance, often used for important correspondence or small, exquisite paintings. Bamboo shoot paper, on the other hand, referred not to its color but to its texture. During the forming process, tiny intentional bumps and irregularities were created on the surface, mimicking the textured skin of a young bamboo shoot. This tooth provided a delightful resistance to the brush, giving calligraphers a tactile feedback that could add a lively, dynamic quality to their strokes. These were not mere production flaws. They were carefully cultivated features, designed to engage both the eye and the hand. The palette of colors available was equally expressive, often achieved through natural dyes. There were warm, ivory-toned papers, deep, scholarly blues derived from indigo, and soft, rose-tinted sheets. A particularly auspicious and revered color was misty red, a soft, faded crimson that evoked the sky at dawn. Using a colored paper wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a symbolic one. The color set the mood of the piece before a single character was written. A poem about loss might be rendered on a pale, silvery gray paper, while a celebratory ode could be presented on a vibrant, golden yellow ground. The paper became part of the narrative, its color and texture working in concert with the ink to create a unified artistic statement that engaged all the senses. The gentle rustle of a fine sheet, the subtle visual texture of its surface, and the faint, organic smell of the fibers all contributed to the complete aesthetic experience, making the creation of art a deeply immersive and almost ritualistic act. In this world, the perfect piece of paper wasn't just a canvas, it was a muse. As paper's influence rippled outward from the Chinese heartland, it encountered two cultures that would not merely adopt the technology, but would elevate it to an art form, imprinting it with their own unique spiritual and aesthetic values. The journey to the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago was not a simple transfer of instructions. It was a process of deep cultural translation, where the basic principles of pulping and sheet forming were reimagined through a different lens of craftsmanship and reverence. In Korea, the art of papermaking is believed to have arrived as early as the 4th or 5th century, likely carried by Buddhist monks traveling along established trade and diplomatic routes. These monks needed a reliable medium for copying sutras, and paper was the perfect vehicle for their spiritual mission. But the Koreans, renowned for their own technological ingenuity, quickly began to refine the process. They didn't just make paper, they engineered it for exceptional durability and beauty, creating a material so respected it was often used as a form of tribute to the Chinese court, and even as a sturdy material for armor and military uniforms. This was the birth of hanji, a paper that would become a cornerstone of Korean cultural identity. The secret to hanji's legendary strength lies in its fibers and a uniquely demanding preparation method. While Chinese papermakers used a variety of materials, Korean artisans honed in on the inner bark of the paper mulberry tree, known locally as dak, but the crucial difference was in the treatment. The Korean process involved an extended, meticulous fermentation stage that could last for weeks. The harvested bark was steamed and then left to soak in water, often in outdoor pits, where natural bacteria and the changing temperatures worked to gently break down the non-fibrous components. This slow fermentation, as opposed to aggressive chemical or mechanical pounding, preserved the incredible length of the cellulose fibers. When it was time to form the sheet, Korean papermakers employed a distinctive technique using a finely woven bamboo screen and a viscous formation aid made from the mucilaginous liquid of hibiscus roots, known as dakpul. This natural glue helped suspend the long fibers evenly in the vat, allowing the papermaker to create a sheet with an exceptionally multi-directional, interlocked grain. The result was a paper of phenomenal resilience, strong enough to be sewn into clothing, used for window coverings that could withstand harsh winters, and so durable that hanji documents and artworks have survived for over 1,000 years in near-perfect condition. Across the Korea Strait, the story of paper's arrival in Japan is wrapped in both history and legend. Official records, such as the Nihon Shoki, chronicle that in the year 610, a Korean Buddhist monk named Dancho arrived at the Japanese court. He was not just a spiritual teacher, he was a skilled craftsman who presented the techniques for making ink, paper, and colors. This official introduction provided the spark, but it was Japan's own deep-seated spiritual connection to nature, embodied in the Shinto religion, that truly shaped the evolution of their paper, known as washi. The very characters for washi mean Japanese paper, distinguishing it from koshi or Chinese paper. From the beginning, the Japanese approach was less about industrial production and more about a sacred, almost ritualistic craft. The pure, cold, fast-flowing mountain streams of Japan were seen as essential, not just for the process, but for the spiritual purity of the final product. The making of washi became a seasonal activity, often undertaken in the winter when the cold water inhibited bacterial growth and made the fibers contract, resulting in a crisper, more defined sheet. The fiber palette for washi was also distinct, often relying on a triumvirate of local plants: Kozo, Mitsumata, and Gampi. Kozo, the paper mulberry, provided long, tough fibers that gave washi its great strength and flexibility. It was the workhorse fiber, used for everything from everyday writing to robust sliding screens. Mitsumata, a shrub cultivated specifically for papermaking, yielded a softer, more pliable fiber that created a luxurious, fine-textured paper with a gentle ivory hue, highly prized for calligraphy and woodblock printing. The most exquisite of all was Gampi, a wild plant whose fibers produced a thin, dense, and naturally glossy paper with a unique resistance to insects. Gampi paper was so sought after for its exquisite surface and translucency that it was often reserved for the most important documents and artistic works. The Japanese process, like the Korean, emphasized long, careful fermentation and a formation method called nagashizuki, which involved a rhythmic, rocking motion when dipping the mold into the vat. This technique allowed the papermaker to build up many thin layers of fibers, creating a sheet of incredible density, smoothness, and structural integrity that was both strong and ethereally beautiful. This profound technical mastery was matched by a cultural reverence that wove paper into the very fabric of Korean and Japanese life. In Japan, paper was never considered a mere commodity. Its purity and its origin in living plants gave it a sacred quality. In Shinto rituals, white paper streamers, known as shide, are used to mark sacred spaces and objects, purifying them and designating the presence of spirits. The act of writing itself was sacred. To discard a piece of paper with writing on it was considered disrespectful to the spirit of the words. This led to solemn ceremonies where used paper was ritually burned in gratitude. In Korea, hanji was so integral to daily existence that it was known as the eternal paper. Its strength made it a versatile architectural element, used for doors, windows, and walls, creating interiors filled with a soft, warm, diffused light. It was used to craft an astonishing array of objects from robust ropes and baskets to elegant clothing and waterproof jackets. This everyday use was not a sign of cheapness, but a testament to the material's trusted quality and its deep connection to a sustainable, resourceful way of living. The paper wasn't just used, it was honored, its life cycle a reflection of a culture that saw beauty and utility as inseparable. The legacy of hanji and washi is a powerful reminder that technological diffusion is rarely a story of simple copying. It is a story of creative adaptation. Korea and Japan took the fundamental gift of papermaking from China and, through centuries of dedicated craftsmanship and deep cultural reflection, transformed it into something uniquely their own. They refined the fibers, perfected the processes, and, most importantly, infused the material with a spiritual significance that elevated it from a writing surface to a cultural treasure. This journey demonstrates that a technology's true impact is not just in its invention, but in its reinterpretation, how it is embraced, perfected, and woven into the soul of a civilization, becoming as enduring as the words it carries. Yet, despite its world-altering potential, the march of paper from the sophisticated courts of the Abbasid Caliphate to the scriptoriums of medieval Europe was not a swift conquest, but a slow, hesitant crawl spanning more than 500 years. This immense delay wasn't due to a lack of trade or contact. It was a story of deep-seated cultural resistance, entrenched economic interests, and a fundamental suspicion of a foreign technology. While the Islamic world had eagerly embraced and refined paper, seeing it as a superior vehicle for the Quran and for the sciences, Europe remained stubbornly loyal to its own traditional writing surface, parchment. This wasn't just a preference, it was an identity, Parchment made from the carefully scraped and stretched skins of sheep, calves, or goats was the very flesh of European knowledge. Producing a single Bible could require the skins of over 200 animals, making each book a monumental investment of labor and resources. This created a world where knowledge was intrinsically expensive, heavy, and rare, a reality that profoundly shaped the power structures of medieval society, concentrating literacy and learning firmly within the church and the aristocracy. The initial resistance from European scribes was both practical and deeply cultural. To a monk who had spent his life perfecting the art of copying sacred texts onto the durable, creamy surface of vellum, the finest grade of parchment made from calfskin, this newfangled material from the Islamic world seemed flimsy and alien. It was often dismissed as a cheap, fragile substitute, a pagan product unfit for the Word of God. Scribes complained that paper lacked the satisfying tactile feedback of parchment, that their quills could catch on its fibrous surface, and most damningly that it was impermanent. Parchment was incredibly durable, capable of lasting for a millennium if cared for, as many surviving manuscripts attest. Paper, especially early European-made paper that used inferior sizing, was seen as ephemeral, susceptible to moisture, rot, and insects. This perception of fragility was a major psychological barrier. Committing divine scripture to a material that might crumble to dust in a few centuries was, for many, an unthinkable act of sacrilege. The very medium was woven into the message, and parchment, with its animal origin and proven longevity, was seen as the only worthy vessel for eternal truths. This cultural aversion was amplified by Europe's fraught political and religious relationship with the paper-producing Islamic world. For centuries, Christendom and Islam were locked in a struggle for territorial and spiritual supremacy, from the Crusades in the Holy Land to the Reconquista in Spain. Paper was not a neutral technology. It was a product of the Saracen, the cultural and military adversary, importing this material from the rival Abbasid Caliphate or later from Muslim-controlled regions of Spain, and Sicily was viewed with deep suspicion, much like a critical technology might be viewed with skepticism from a geopolitical rival today. Using paper could be seen, on some level, as adopting the tools of the enemy. This inherent bias slowed its acceptance in monastic and scholarly circles, creating a situation where paper was known, traded, and even used for mundane purposes like packaging or commercial records long before it was deemed acceptable for sacred or literary texts. The journey of paper into Europe, therefore, did not begin in the hallowed halls of monasteries, but in the pragmatic, multicultural trading ports where commerce trumped creed. The first beachheads for papermaking on European soil were established not through intellectual curiosity, but through military conquest and cultural overlap in the very regions where these two worlds collided. The earliest known paper mill in Europe was founded in the city of Zatava, in the Muslim-controlled region of Al-Andalus, around the year 1056. This was not a European invention, but an extension of the Islamic papermaking tradition, thriving in a sophisticated, multicultural society where the technology was already mature. When Christian forces gradually reconquered these territories during the long campaign of the Reconquista, they didn't destroy these mills, they inherited them. The victorious kingdoms of Aragon and Castile suddenly found themselves in possession of a functioning, advanced industrial technology. They recognized its immense economic and administrative potential and quickly began to operate these mills themselves, with captured Muslim artisans often continuing the work, now under new Christian masters. A similar transmission occurred in Sicily, another vibrant crossroads, where paper production was documented by the 12th century after the Norman conquest, displaced the island's Arab rulers. From these two southern European footholds, Spain and Italy, the knowledge of papermaking began its slow, reluctant percolation northward. Even as production moved into Christian hands, the early European paper industry struggled to match the quality of its Islamic predecessors. The finest papers from Damascus and Baghdad were made from high-quality linen and hemp rags, meticulously processed. European mills, especially as they moved further from the source of the knowledge, often used lower-grade materials and less refined techniques. The resulting paper was frequently coarse, discolored, and uneven, which only reinforced the skepticism of scribes and scholars. Furthermore, the powerful parchment-making guilds, whose entire livelihood was tied to the old technology, actively lobbied against the upstart material. They were a well-established, influential economic bloc with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The adoption of paper was not just a technological shift, it was a direct threat to their trade, and they used their political power to slow its advance, arguing for the superiority and tradition of parchment at every turn. For centuries, paper existed in a kind of technological limbo in Europe, known, produced, but not fully trusted, used for accounting, personal correspondence, and popular pamphlets, while the most important books and documents continue to be penned on the trusted surface of animal skin. The turning point, the event that finally shattered this centuries-old resistance, arrived not from within the papermaking world itself, but from an external revolutionary shock: the invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. Gutenberg's press created an insatiable, industrial-scale demand for a writing surface that parchment could never fulfill. The economics were simple and brutal. Printing a single copy of the Gutenberg Bible required the skins of approximately 300 animals. To produce hundreds of copies would have required a herd the size of a small county and would have been financially ruinous. Paper was the only material that could possibly meet this new, voracious demand. It was uniform, allowing for consistent inking and pressure from the press. It was relatively cheap, enabling the production of books at a fraction of the former cost, and it was available in the large, flat sheets necessary for printing. The press and paper were a match made in industrial heaven, and together they broke the power of the parchment guilds and the conservative scribes almost overnight. The medium was no longer chosen for its perceived permanence or its sacred connotations, but for its utility, its scalability, and its role in a new, democratizing information revolution that would forever change the Western world. So we arrive at the moment where two separate streams of innovation, both with their origins in ancient China, finally converged in a small workshop in Mainz, Germany, creating a perfect storm that would shatter the medieval world. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press was a mechanical marvel, a symphony of precision cast metal type, a custom-made oil-based ink, and a modified wine press. But for all its ingenuity, the press was just a potential, a powerful engine with no fuel. That fuel, the indispensable feedstock for the revolution, was paper. Imagine Gutenberg setting his first line of type, inking the raised surfaces, and then reaching not for a sheet of precious, expensive parchment, but for a stack of uniform, flat, and relatively cheap paper. This was the critical partnership. The press could stamp out a page in minutes, but it demanded a medium that could be produced in the thousands of sheets to make the entire enterprise economically viable. Without the centuries of papermaking knowledge that had slowly filtered into Europe, Gutenberg's invention would have been a fascinating but ultimately impractical curiosity, a machine that could produce books at an unprecedented rate, but only at a cost so astronomical that no one could afford to buy them. The economic reality was stark and simple. Let's consider the numbers behind Gutenberg's most famous project, the 42-line Bible. To produce a single copy of this work on parchment, the finest calfskin vellum, would have required the skins of approximately 300 animals. Now, multiply that by the estimated 180 copies he initially printed. To produce that entire run on parchment would have necessitated the herds from over 50,000 calves, an unimaginable logistical and financial undertaking that would have made each Bible as expensive as a large house. Paper changed that equation completely. A single ream of paper, 500 sheets, could be produced from recycled linen and cotton rags, the discarded clothing of a city's population. This wasn't just cheaper, it was a different economic universe. The cost of a book plummeted from being a treasure that only a cathedral or a king could own to a commodity that a growing, literate merchant class could afford. The printing press created the demand for mass literacy, but it was paper that supplied the means, turning the book from a sacred, rare artifact into a tool for education, argument, and entertainment. This sudden, dramatic drop in the cost of information triggered a series of social quakes that fundamentally reshaped European civilization. The most immediate and explosive impact was the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, the act itself was a traditional academic gesture. What made it revolutionary was that his arguments were almost immediately printed on pamphlets and broadsheets, spreading across Germany and then Europe in a matter of weeks, not years. For the first time, a theological debate bypassed the established channels of the church and was fought in the public sphere on printed paper. Luther's own German translation of the New Testament sold an estimated 5,000 copies in just 2 months. This was a direct challenge to the church's monopoly on biblical interpretation, and it was fought with ink and paper. The Catholic Church's subsequent counter-reformation was itself waged with printed texts, creating a literal pamphlet war where ideas, both orthodox and heretical, could be distributed and debated by thousands. The very unity of Western Christendom was shattered not by armies, but by the printed word, a conflict made possible because paper provided the cheap, abundant ammunition. Beyond the religious upheaval, the paper-backed printing press became the primary engine of the scientific revolution. Before print, scientific knowledge was fragile. A discovery recorded in a handful of handwritten manuscripts could be easily lost, distorted, or suppressed. Now, observations could be published, shared, and critiqued by an international community of scholars. When Nicolaus Copernicus' work on a heliocentric universe was published on his deathbed, it entered a world where its radical ideas could be precisely reproduced and distributed, ensuring they would not disappear. Astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler could build upon each other's printed data. The meticulous anatomical drawings in Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica were a product of the printing press. Such precise, reproducible illustrations were impossible in the age of scribble copying, where every new version introduced errors. Science progressed from being the private pursuit of a few isolated individuals to a collaborative, cumulative enterprise, and its shared language was the printed page on paper. Errors could be identified and corrected in new editions. Knowledge became stable, and the scientific method itself relied on the ability to disseminate and verify findings through a reliable, permanent medium. The very structure of human thought began to change in response to this new information environment. As printed books became commonplace, they encouraged new habits of reading and learning. The handwritten manuscript was often read aloud in groups. The printed book was typically read silently, privately. This fostered a new kind of individual, critical reflection. Furthermore, the need to organize the exploding world of knowledge led to the standardization of features we now take for granted: page numbers, tables of contents, indexes, and consistent punctuation. These were not just minor conveniences. They were cognitive tools that made it easier to navigate complex arguments and retrieve specific information quickly. The Random Access Codex, empowered by paper and print, began to supersede the linear scroll, reshaping how people organized knowledge in their own minds. The Republic of Letters, a network of intellectuals spanning Europe, was sustained entirely through the exchange of letters and books made of paper. This created a new form of community, one based on shared ideas rather than geographic proximity, a direct precursor to our modern intellectual and academic worlds. The democratization of knowledge created by cheap paper didn't just spread existing ideas. It actively generated new ways of thinking, laying the groundwork for the Enlightenment and the modern world's belief in reason, progress, and the power of the informed individual. But how can we be so certain about dates and recipes that are thousands of years old? How do we move from historical texts and intriguing legends to verifiable scientific fact? The answer lies in a powerful suite of modern forensic techniques that allow us to interrogate these ancient paper fragments directly, turning them from silent artifacts into eloquent witnesses. This is where the narrative of history collides with the precision of the laboratory, where carbon dating and fiber analysis provide the hard evidence that either confirms our oldest stories or, as we've seen, completely rewrites them. It's a scientific detective story that begins with the very atoms that make up the paper itself. The most revolutionary tool in this investigative arsenal is undoubtedly radiocarbon dating, a method that allows us to essentially ask the paper, "How old are you?" and get a scientifically rigorous answer. The principle is as elegant as it is profound. High in the atmosphere, cosmic rays constantly bombard nitrogen atoms, transforming them into a radioactive isotope of carbon, known as carbon-14. Like all radioactive elements, carbon-14 is unstable and decays at a perfectly predictable rate. Its half-life is about 5,730 years, meaning that after that amount of time, half of the carbon-14 in any sample will have decayed away. Now, while it's radioactive, this carbon-14 combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, which is absorbed by plants during photosynthesis. When an animal eats that plant, or in our case, when a papermaker harvests hemp or mulberry bark, the carbon from the atmosphere becomes locked into the plant's cellulose fibers. The moment the plant is cut, it stops exchanging carbon with the atmosphere. The radioactive clock starts ticking. By carefully measuring the minuscule amount of remaining carbon-14 in a paper sample and comparing it to the known levels in the atmosphere, scientists can calculate with remarkable accuracy how many years have passed since the plant was alive. This technique is what definitively placed the Baqiao paper fragments in the Warring States period and the Fangmatan maps in the early Western Han, providing the irrefutable evidence that pushed paper's origins back centuries before Cai Lun. Of course, this scientific process is incredibly delicate. To perform radiocarbon dating, conservators must first obtain a sample, a process that is as careful as it is destructive. They might take a tiny sliver of paper, often just a few milligrams smaller than a grain of rice, from an already damaged edge or an area that won't affect the text or image. This sample is then subjected to a rigorous cleaning process to remove any contaminants, such as glue from later repairs, dirt, or even the oils from the fingers of the people who handled it over the centuries. Any foreign carbon could throw off the date dramatically. The purified sample is then burned, converting it into pure carbon, which is analyzed in an accelerator mass spectrometer. This machine is so sensitive it can count individual carbon-14 atoms. The result is a date range, usually expressed with a plus or minus margin of error. For example, a result might be 200 years before the Common Era, plus or minus 25 years. This scientific timestamp provides an objective anchor point, independent of historical bias or political agenda, allowing us to build a truly reliable chronology for paper's evolution. While radiocarbon dating tells us when a paper was made, it doesn't reveal how it was made. For that, we turn to the world of microscopic forensics, fiber analysis. Under the powerful lens of a microscope, a seemingly smooth sheet of paper reveals itself to be a tangled jungle of individual plant fibers. Each type of plant used in papermaking has a unique fibrous signature, a distinctive shape, size, and cell structure that acts like a botanical fingerprint. An expert looking through the microscope can identify these fibers with astonishing precision. The long, slender, and relatively smooth fibers of hemp are unmistakable. They are the workhorses, providing the foundational strength. The fibers from the paper mulberry tree are also long, but they often have a more ribbon-like appearance and distinctive nodes or bumps. The shorter, fatter fibers of rice straw or bamboo create a different texture altogether. By analyzing the specific mix of fibers in an ancient paper sample, scientists can reconstruct the original recipe. They can determine if it was a coarse, utilitarian sheet made mostly from hemp rope, or a refined, writing quality paper that incorporated the softer, whiter fibers of mulberry bark. This forensic botany allows us to peer into the papermaker's vat and understand the choices they made, the resources they had available, and the technological sophistication of their craft. This microscopic investigation goes even further, revealing the very processing techniques used 200 years ago. The way a fiber looks under the microscope tells a story of its journey from plant to pulp. Fibers that are cut short and frayed suggest a vigorous, prolonged pounding with mallets, a mechanical pulping method. If the fibers are more separated than cut, it can indicate the use of fermentation, where the slow action of bacteria and time did the work of breaking down the plant material. We can even see the evidence of additives. The presence of certain mineral crystals, like gypsum or kaolin clay, reveals the use of fillers to add weight, opacity, and smoothness to the sheet. Most tellingly, fiber analysis can detect the remnants of sizing agents. Gelatin from animal hides, for instance, can sometimes be identified coating the fibers, explaining why ink sits so perfectly on the surface of a particular manuscript. By reading these microscopic clues, we are not just identifying ingredients. We are reconstructing the entire ancient manufacturing process, from the first chop of the axe to the final press of the sheet. The true power of these techniques emerges when they are used in concert, creating a multi-faceted profile of a single artifact. Let's take the iconic Diamond Sutra, the world's oldest dated printed book. We know its date from the colophon, 868 AD. Radiocarbon dating of its paper can confirm that the material itself aligns with that time period, verifying that the paper wasn't a later replacement. Then, fiber analysis can examine the sheet to confirm it was made from mulberry and hemp, typical for high-quality Tang Dynasty paper. We can look for evidence of sizing to understand how it was prepared for printing. We can even analyze the blackness of the ink under different wavelengths of light to determine if it was a carbon-based ink, which was standard for printing, or an iron gall ink, which was more common for manuscripts. This collaborative approach between historians, chemists, and conservators builds an incontrovertible case. It turns a beautiful artifact into a dense packet of historical data, allowing us to confirm the authenticity of masterpieces, expose modern forgeries, and map the trade routes of papermaking knowledge as specific fiber recipes spread from one region to another. Ultimately, these scientific methods have transformed our understanding from a history based on written accounts to a history written in the physical object itself. The story of paper is no longer confined to the scrolls of court historians. It is encoded in the cellulose of every surviving fragment. Radiocarbon dating provides the immutable timeline, and fiber analysis deciphers the technological language of the craftsman. Together, they form an unparalleled toolkit for solving historical mysteries, allowing us to cross-examine the evidence with a level of precision that would have been unimaginable to the scholars of previous generations. They have given a voice to the anonymous artisans, the ones who truly pioneered this world-changing technology, allowing their legacy, written not in ink but in the very structure of their creations, to finally be heard across the centuries. For all the incredible discoveries we've made, from the Baqiao fragments to the Dunhuang Library, the story of ancient paper remains tantalizingly incomplete, filled with gaps that challenge our modern understanding. We have pieced together the broad strokes of its history, yet the most intimate secrets of the master papermakers, their exact formulas, their most sophisticated techniques, often died with them. One of the most enduring puzzles revolves around the legendary recipes for the most coveted papers, sheets so perfect they were described in poetry. We know the general ingredients: mulberry bark, hemp, rags, but the precise ratios, the specific subspecies of plants used, the exact duration of fermentation under varying seasonal conditions, these are details rarely written down. They were trade secrets, passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken, silent chain for generations. The difference between a good sheet of paper and a transcendent one, the kind that made a calligrapher's heart sing, likely lay in these subtle, unrecorded nuances. Think of it like a master chef's signature dish. We might have the list of ingredients, but without knowing the precise timing, the specific heat, the chef's intuitive touch, we can never truly recreate the masterpiece. For every celebrated paper like Xuan paper, whose tradition continues today, how many other legendary recipes have been lost entirely, their unique textures and performance known only from fleeting descriptions in ancient texts. This leads us directly to another profound mystery: the existence of undiscovered papermaking centers. Our historical map is drawn largely from surviving records and archaeological luck. But what if major hubs of innovation have been completely erased from history? The Chinese Empire was vast, and its bureaucratic reach, while impressive, didn't extend to documenting every local industry. It's entirely plausible that a remote river valley, blessed with perfect water and abundant raw materials, developed a distinctive papermaking tradition that supplied a whole region for centuries, only to be abandoned and forgotten after a war, a famine, or a shift in trade routes. The sands of the Taklamakan Desert have already yielded incredible finds. What other caches of early paper lie buried beneath the soil of forgotten Silk Road oases, or hidden within tombs not yet opened by archaeologists? Each new discovery, like Fangmatan, has forced us to redraw the timeline. The next could reveal an entirely unknown lineage of paper, perhaps one that used a unique local plant fiber or a different formation method, showing us that the evolution of this technology was even more diverse and widespread than we currently imagine. Then there is the enigmatic world of ancient sizing and coloring, a realm of organic chemistry that we have only partially decoded. We understand the basic principles of using starch or gelatin, but the highest grade papers often featured additional, secret ingredients to achieve their legendary qualities. Historical accounts mention papers that were naturally insect repellent, their scent pleasant even after centuries. What botanical extracts or mineral treatments did papermakers use to achieve this? Were certain barks or leaves added to the pulp vat to deter bookworms, creating a form of ancient preservation we haven't yet identified? The vibrant, stable colors seen in some manuscripts, deep indigos, radiant yellows, and that coveted, misty red, pose another challenge. While we can identify some natural dyes, the specific mordants used to bind the color to the cellulose fibers, ensuring it wouldn't fade in sunlight or bleed when damp, represent a sophisticated chemical knowledge that is often lost. Recreating these effects today with historical accuracy is incredibly difficult, suggesting that the artisans possessed a deep, experiential understanding of their local environment, knowing which stream's water worked best with which bark and which dye, a symbiotic relationship with nature that is hard to replicate in a modern laboratory. Perhaps the most haunting question is whether we have truly mastered all the techniques for creating paper of unparalleled longevity. We marvel at paper from the Tang Dynasty that remains supple and strong after more than 1,000 years, while paper from the 19th century can sometimes crumble in our hands. What did the ancient masters know about purification, about pH balance, about creating a truly archival sheet that we have since forgotten in our pursuit of mass production? Their process was slow, deliberate, and attuned to natural cycles. They used fresh, flowing water and avoided the metallic contaminants and acidic additives that would later plague Western papermaking.